heard cries for help. Help, help, and no don't. It must have been half an hour later, a child cried out real loud, like it was hurt.
It was the fear of not knowing who amongst them was capable of abducting a little girl that was terrifying for the residents of Queensville. Stepping outside meant praying that their neighbor wasn't a killer. When 9-year-old Christine Jessop went missing on October 3, 1984, the heartbreak and shock were palpable. And as hundreds of people searched for her, there was one individual who went unnoticed. How did Christine disappear from her house in broad daylight? What happened to her? Welcome to M7 Crime Storytime, where we shed light on solved, unsolved, and mysterious cases across the country. Welcome to Queensville, a small town where stories rest in eternal embrace. While the city continued to grow and expand with more malls and neighborhoods, Queensville held on to its rural charm. It served as a refuge, preserving the simplicity of country life amidst the bustling metropolis. Nestled between the fields and forests, it's separated from the Toronto city by a few contracting kilometers and a 4-lane expressway. Queensville is little more than a dusty crossroads. It's a place where nature still has a fighting chance. Before one fateful day in 1984, few would have given Queensville a second thought. But soon, it became the center of attention, where a horrible tragedy occurred that changed the entire community forever. The story began in the early 1970s. Robert Bob Jessop and Janet Jessop's journey to have a child was not an easy one. After struggling to conceive, they welcomed a baby boy, Ken, through adoption. But fate had a surprise in store for them. A miracle occurred, and Christine Marion Jessop was born on November 29, 1974, catching her parents off guard. Her early years were plagued with health problems, and her frequent hospital stays were a source of constant worry for her family. However, Christine was a fighter. She was the spitting image of her mother, exhibiting both maturity and childlike innocence simultaneously. Her love for all things delicate was unmatched, and she had dreams of becoming a veterinarian. Every week, Christine's visits to the Balladen farm to play with the animals were a highlight of her life. Christine's tendency to talk a lot, or as some might say, her motor mouth, was often misinterpreted as childish behavior. However, she was a bright, inquisitive girl who loved to ask questions and learn new things. The fall of 1984 was in full swing, and the Jessop family had a secret they were carefully guarding. Everyone thought that Bob, Christine's father, had embarked on a business trip to California. In reality, he was behind bars, serving time for charges of financial fraud. Meanwhile, Janet, Christine's mother, had the plan to ensure that she was always there to greet Christine as she stepped off the school bus every afternoon. Janet used to rush home from work at the Sears store in Richmond Hill. On that warm day of October 3, 1984, Christine was bursting with excitement to show off her new recorder to her mother and her brother Ken. She walked out of school with her friend Leslie Chipman and spent about 20 minutes playing on the swings. They decided to meet up later that day. At 3:50 p.m., when she entered the house, Christine knew that nobody was home. Her mother had informed her earlier that she was going to visit her dad in prison and take 14-year-old Ken to the dentist. There was a possibility they'd be back by 4, but it was uncertain. The only company for Christine was her lively dog, Freckles. She looked for a nickel in the dish full of coins before leaving the house and attempted to call her friend Leslie, but the line was busy. So she made her way to the general store to buy herself some bubble gum. Then she walked her bike across Leslie Street into her driveway. By 4:10 p.m., Janet and Ken returned home. They saw Christine's red bike lying on its side with a bent handlebar and carrier. Janet noticed that Christine's jacket was hanging on a high peg, which was unusual since she couldn't have reached it without a chair. Ken called out to her in the basement, wondering if she might be spending time with her beloved pet frog, Harold. but there was no response. Something was definitely wrong. They decided to wait until supper, hoping that she'd come home soon. But as the hours passed, Janet's fear grew stronger, and by 7 p.m., she knew she had to call the police.
We looked everywhere. And then finally I thought, well, I think we better call the police. Something's wrong.
The sergeant who handled the call had a gut feeling that something was amiss and sent a car right away. As word spread of Christine's disappearance, the Queensville Fire Department sprang into action, followed closely by volunteer firemen from nearby areas. Before long, a swarm of concerned citizens were scouring every inch of the neighborhood, from the fields and graveyards to the dense forest below the ridge. It was a search like no other in Canadian history. The town was united in their desperate search for Christine, but the looming question remained, where could she have gone? The detectives considered the possibility that she'd run away to see her father in prison, or that she'd stayed with a friend for longer than expected. But all these theories led to dead ends. When the police knocked on the door of Christine's 24-year-old neighbor, Guy Paul Morin, he initially thought it was about a complaint regarding his construction work. But then he surprised his father, Alphonse, by saying, "I bet that little Christine is gone." Guy Paul and his father often played a game of predicting events, though they never actually bet money on it. Alphonse suggested, "No, maybe Ken. Ken's at that age of socializing where he's starting to get into trouble." Alphonse was surprised at how easily his son won the bet this time, as Christine was really missing. The police asked some basic questions, then went away. While the entire town was searching for a girl they didn't even know, her next-door neighbors, the Morin family, preferred to stay at home. Detective John Nichet took it upon himself to break the news of Christine's disappearance to her father, Bob Jessop. Other inmates at the jailhouse began to pressure the guards and administrators to release Bob so he could be with his family. The next day, on October 4th, 1984, Leslie, Christine's friend, informed the officers that Christine had received a hate letter from two of her friends. So the detectives went to Christine's school to analyze the theory that her disappearance was the result of a school-based rivalry. The principal of Queensville Public School, Ross Brethur, had informed the media that all 106 students at the school received street-proofing education to prevent such incidents as Christine's abduction. It involved identifying and responding to uncomfortable and dangerous situations. He'd instructed the staff to keep the incident low-key. Nevertheless, things had taken an unexpected turn, and the school became a hub of chaos, fear, and rumors in just a few hours. With parents becoming more paranoid and protective of their children, homicide detective John Shepard noticed a change in the atmosphere of Queensville after Christine Jessop's disappearance. Several theories were developed based on the circumstances surrounding Christine's disappearance. One theory was that Christine might have seen an adult figure and dropped her bike. But did she drop her bike in fright at the sight of a stranger? Or was it just an absent-minded action in response to a familiar face smiling at her? The time frame was really narrow. Either the killer lucked out, or he had an intimate knowledge of the family's schedule. There'd been no ransom demand yet, and the possibility of a slaying by a deranged person was unusual, but not impossible. On the same day of October 3rd, 1984, there were 4 phone calls that came into the Jessop residence, with the caller remaining silent before hanging up. At this time, everyone was a suspect. The investigators suspected that one of Ken's friends might have had a dark desire for the young girl, so they asked Ken to provide a list of his friends' names. They were on high alert as Bob's absence added a layer of mystery to the case, raising questions about whether Christine had been snatched by someone who knew that Bob was no longer in the picture. Was it possible that even a fellow inmate had taken Christine in an act of revenge? Or was the disappearance somehow linked to the fraud that had landed Bob in jail? The search for Christine had gone stagnant until a tip from a neighboring town led the York Regional Police to Dean McPhail, a troubled teenager known for carrying a knife. His criminal record included tying up a woman, exposing himself to 2 girls, and assaulting a 10-year-old boy. And if that wasn't enough, MacPhail had also worked briefly as a gravedigger at the Queensville Cemetery, giving him ample opportunity to observe Christine's movements. Even his probation officer had urged the police to consider him as a suspect, but it did not pan out. Another theory was that Gordon Simpson, Janet's father, and his new wife Hilda had kidnapped their own granddaughter because they were wary of the way Janet was raising Christine in Bob's absence. Hilda had been intrusive and critical of everything Janet did, and always said the weirdest things. When the Jessop couple moved into their Queensville residence, Hilda said, "Something terrible would happen to Christine in this house." It led many to speculate that she was involved in Christine's disappearance. Later, some of her neighbors came forward with another revelation about Christine. They claimed that she often hung out with boys until late at night, sometimes even walking home with them at 9 or 10 p.m. Christine had told her friends about an older boyfriend. It was the opposite of what Janet had told the police. When Detective John Nashe visited Janet, Christine's mother, he was taken aback by her calm demeanor. All she said was, "Hi," and didn't ask any questions about any leads. Wally Rabson, Bob's brother-in-law, told the detectives that something's not right here. Janet just seems to be completely unaffected by what's going on. However, the detectives knew that people grieve differently, so they gave Janet the benefit of the doubt and didn't reveal their suspicions to the public. However, Sally Browning, a family friend, mentioned that when Janet's mother died, she had to take Valium to calm herself. Yet, with her missing daughter, Janet seemed relaxed. She kept saying Christine was safe and warm in a wooded building and would be home soon. People suspected that the whole disappearance was staged to get Bob out of jail, who was, in fact, released within 3 days on October 6, 1984 on humanitarian grounds. Soon, the entire village, including Bob himself, had thoughts about an unbothered mother of a missing child.
She wouldn't hurt anybody. Just wouldn't hurt anybody at all.
Queensville had never been more active. Within days, different sightings of unusual activity in the area were reported. The first one came from Sandra and Bruce Horwood, who witnessed a disturbing sight while driving. A man in a greenish-blue car was forcefully holding a struggling child under his arm. They debated following the car, but decided that he could have been a parent. All over the town, there was talk of a white, off-white, or silver car seen during the time of Christine's disappearance. Detectives received a promising tip from 3 boys who went searching for Christine on a country road outside Newmarket. A silver Datsun stopped beside them, driven by a man about 25 years old, offering to help with a searchlight attached to his dashboard. However, his car was covered in mud and had a repulsive smell. He ducked down when he thought a police car was coming toward them and rushed away immediately. It hadn't been a police car, just another vehicle searching for Christine. But it was disappointing for the detectives that no other information about this mystery man could be recovered. As the investigation dragged on, a glimmer of hope emerged in the form of a diary found by 2 curious kids in a rundown barn. Mike Lundgren, Jessop's neighbor, took a friend with him to inspect the barn. But what they found in the barn was straight out of a horror movie. Rusty pulleys and chains lay strewn around like torture devices, and a giant spider web made of a fishing line almost ensnared them. It was the cryptic writing scrawled on the walls that really sent shivers down their spines. The phrases, "Finally see the bird disappears," and "Read the words are hidden," were eerily odd. They located a man who rented the farmhouse nearby. He claimed the dairy as his own and said that an artist had written those words on the walls for his failed love. The dark shadows of suspicion loomed over everyone. But there was Philip Brennan, a man accused of unspeakable crimes against his own flesh and blood. His wife had bravely come forward to report the disturbing allegations of his inappropriate behavior with their 5-year-old daughter. The authorities scoured his home and uncovered horrific adult content, but his alibi seemed to hold up. Yet the lingering doubt remained. Months passed by. The investigation into Christine's disappearance was at a standstill, and Bob Jessop was growing increasingly frustrated. Little did he know he was going to find a clue. While cleaning out his garage one day, he stumbled upon a crumpled piece of paper. Upon closer inspection, he realized it was a map, crudely drawn but unmistakable. And shockingly, it showed a route to his own home. He traced the faint lines with his eyes as they led many kilometers eastward to a portion of Durham region. Bob immediately called for his wife Janet, and together they tried to make sense of the map. They eventually realized that it terminated awfully close to the home of Hector Drummond, an old family friend of Janet's father who visited the Jessop home 3 or 4 times a year. Janet's mother had once claimed that Hector was an odd fellow who liked dressing up in women's clothing, but over the years, she felt comfortable around him. After looking at the map, Janet and Bob knew they had to figure out the truth themselves. They visited Hector's house and found a notepad on the table. After examining it in bright light, Bob was shocked to find faint lines of the same map on the pad. Despite being a family friend, Hector Drummond was not immune to suspicion. The police investigated him thoroughly, but he was eventually cleared of any involvement in Christine's disappearance. The discovery of the map was just another bizarre twist in a case that seemed to be full of red herrings and dead ends. As the sun rose on December 31st, 1984, Fred Patterson noticed something strange happening in the nearby field in Sunderland, Ontario, approximately 100 kilometers northeast of Toronto. His German Shepherd was roaming around with a stray Great Dane, both barking sporadically. The field, north of Patterson's home and south of the 4th concession, was owned by James Cull, a high school vice principal from Toronto. Patterson had been listening to the dogs bark for a long time, and finally giving in, he approached the area with his 2 daughters to inspect it. He found a beaten-down trail leading to a garbage heap. But what he saw next left him bewildered and horrified. It was a body of a pig dressed in clothes, and he immediately assumed it was the result of a tasteless teenage prank. But then he saw the feet, and a wave of recognition washed over him. One of them was wearing a white sock. It was a child's body discovered in the field, which could potentially have been someone who took their own life, or perhaps another unfortunate victim. However, unless the Pattersons were completely isolated from the world, it would have been impossible to remain unaware of Christine's disappearance. Even Patterson's young daughters knew they'd stumbled upon a discovery that had eluded thousands of searchers for 3 long months. Without a second thought, Patterson ran back to his home and called the Durham Regional Police. The discovery of the child's remains was enough to make even the most experienced investigators feel queasy. As they peered at the skeleton, it became clear that the upper part of the body had decomposed, leaving only bones behind. But there was something even more disturbing about the scene. The legs of the child were unnaturally splayed apart and bent at the knees, eerily reminiscent of the way the notorious Boston Strangler, Albert DeSalvo, left his victims. It was a detail that only added to the perplexing nature of the crime. The scattered blue clothing, the pair of panties, and an abandoned running shoe suggested a possible struggle. As the investigators meticulously combed the area, their attention was drawn to another crucial discovery. A tan pouch caught their eyes. Inside, nestled snugly, was a recorder, the Aulos number 202. The words Christine Jessop were etched onto the label. Meanwhile, in the distance, more evidence was being unearthed. Buttons, a plastic drinking glass. Each item was carefully handled and marked, waiting to reveal its secrets. As John Hilsden Smith, the chief pathologist for Ontario, examined the remains, the group of investigators around him noticed something peculiar. Despite the advanced state of decomposition, a fair amount of hair was still adhering to the scalp remains, swept forward over the skull. But it was the chain that caught their attention, with several hairs stuck into the dried flesh around it. One of them was darker and of a different thickness than the rest. To confirm her identity, dental records were checked, but the discovery that her teeth had turned pink led Smith to order a diatom test to determine if she'd drowned. However, the results were inconclusive, with so many diatoms present that Smith believed the test was contaminated. Dental records showed a match to Christine Jessop. Before the Jessop family could be informed, the detectives knocked at the house of Reverend Bev Hall and her husband. When she answered the door and saw the detective standing there, she knew what had happened. Detective Nishay briefed her and requested her presence in the room to calm down Christine's family when they received the news. When Bob and Janet saw the detectives and the Reverend in their driveway, they thought, "So this is it." Janet kept demanding, "Why? Where's Chrissy?" while Bob just wanted to know if his little girl had suffered. As the medical examiners continued to examine the remains of Christine, Smith noticed discolorations on her skull, which was evidence of not one, but 2 vicious blows. The injuries occurred before her death and were caused by a blunt object or a fall. Could it have been a hammer, a bat, or something else entirely? He couldn't say for sure. But what he did know was that Christine was still alive when she suffered that fatal blow to her head. As he sifted through the soil, his eyes fixated on an object, a rib with a deep incision caused by a sharp object. He inspected more ribs, each with nicks just a few millimeters deep, but all caused by an incredibly sharp cutting edge. The cause of death was becoming increasingly clear. The killer had mercilessly stabbed Christine. It proved a perfect explanation as to why the upper body had decomposed so quickly. The evidence at the scene was puzzling, to say the least. There were more inconsistencies and discrepancies than answers. The buttons found at the scene didn't match the color of Christine's blouse, and several of them were missing. The blue sweater that Christine's grandmother had knitted was nowhere to be found. She was found wearing a gray turtleneck sweater. The Jessops had no recollection of Christine ever owning one like it. The clothing suggested that she'd been kept somewhere else before being brought to the crime site. But the detectives had found bodily fluids on her underwear. It didn't make sense for the killer to have replaced her clothing at the site, so it seemed likely that at least one attack had taken place elsewhere. Nothing was adding up, and they knew they had to keep digging to uncover the truth. As the search for the murder weapon proved fruitless, the investigation took a chilling turn. During a subsequent search of the area, a human rib and a vertebra were found. Then, a woman named Lydia Robinson claimed to have heard screams coming from the direction of the body site one night in the beginning of October.
I heard cries for help. Help, help, and no, don't. It must have been half an hour later, a child cried out real loud, like it was hurt.
She phoned a local television station to describe what she'd heard. "Help, help, please don't," the voice cried out in desperation. The screaming started off subdued, but became increasingly frantic. After listening for several minutes, Lydia was able to determine that the sounds were coming from the south or west. The only house in that area belonged to Doug Barnes and Sharon Riseborough, but Lydia had never heard any domestic fights coming from their house before. As the screams continued, Lydia heard what sounded like a child crying before a car drove away from the area. Behind every crime lay a haunting truth, a trail of grief-stricken individuals who, for whatever reason, chose not to take action when they could have. The case was stalled until a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon with the discovery of the body, which had been discovered in Durham Region, prompting the York Police to pass the baton to the Durham Regional Police. Inspector Robert Brown was now in charge, and his team of detectives was desperate to find answers. But all leads had gone cold, and the detectives were grasping at straws. Then, on February 14, 1985, they decided to question Christine's mother. They hoped to extract any information about someone who could have harmed her daughter. Janet had no name, but the detectives refused to give up. They needed one name, just one, to crack the case wide open. And finally, after much prodding, she labeled her neighbor, Guy Paul Morin, as a weird-type guy who played the clarinet and kept honeybees. Guy Paul Morin, born in 1961 to Alphonse and Ida Morin, belonged to a family that valued privacy above all else. They were kind neighbors, always willing to lend a helping hand and trustworthy too. Could this quiet and unassuming man really be capable of such a heinous crime? The detectives seemed to have no doubts, but Morin had a strong alibi. He'd been at his job at a furniture manufacturing facilities located 57 kilometers away from the crime scene. The detectives verified his punch-out time, 3:32 p.m., which means he couldn't have returned home before 4:14 p.m., well after Christine's parents had arrived at 4:10 p.m. The investigators probed further, questioning why Morin hadn't participated in the search for Christine on the night she disappeared. He explained that if the Jessops had asked for his help, he would have gladly joined in. However, he'd been preoccupied with assisting his father in installing weeping tile around their home's foundation. With the entire town already engaged in the search, he believed one more person wouldn't make much of a difference. Seeking to gauge his opinion of Christine, the detectives inquired about his perception of the young girl. Morin's response painted her as sweet and innocent. But then, with a habit of expressing whatever thought came to mind, he uttered a fateful remark. But they sometimes grow up to be corrupt. To the detectives, this seemingly innocent comment became a motive. In their eyes, this weird-type neighbor harbored resentment towards women, seeking retribution for what he perceived as the inevitable allure and promiscuity that would come with age. The detectives grappled with their suspicions, torn between the strong alibi and the unsettling remarks made by him. A few weeks later, Morin willingly allowed a band leader's daughter, who was actually an undercover police officer, to pluck strands of hair from the jazz group members as part of a cosmetics class project on hair analysis. The Center of Forensic Sciences became the battleground where Morin's fate hung in the balance.
They are your fingerprints, they are on her clothing, and that's your fingerprint up there. And I say, it's impossible. I have never touched that child, physically touched that child.
Suspicion had been cast upon him, and his hair sample was taken for testing. The hair found on Christine's necklace had decomposed over time, but it was still deemed consistent with Morin's sample, causing the detectives to release a sketch that matched his features. As the evening of April 22, 1985 unfolded, Guy-Paul Morin found himself on the way to band practice, oblivious to the storm that was about to shatter his world. Caught off guard by flashing lights in his rearview mirror, he assumed it was a routine traffic stop for not wearing a seatbelt. Instead, those lights signaled the arrival of 14 officers who had sealed off the area.
I thought my seatbelt. I better pull over, and I did so.
He was being arrested for the murder of Christine Jessop. In utter shock, he uttered the words, "What? You're joking."
Initially, I said, "Oh, it's you guys." Like, I was surprised, really, to see them. They said, "Well, you're under arrest for the murder of Christine Jessop, your neighbor." I said, "Right, come on, guys, you're kidding." He said, "No, Guy, we're not. We know what we're doing. We don't make mistakes."
The detectives were desperate to find holes in Morin's alibi. They retraced Janet and Ken's steps on the day of the abduction and suggested that Janet's memory was faulty. She stood by her words, but as the detectives persisted, Janet's confidence began to crumble. Eventually, she revised her timing, moving it forward to as much as 25 minutes later, leaving Morin's alibi in shambles. As January 7, 1986 dawned, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Guy-Paul Morin's murder trial commenced. The prosecution's case against him was flimsy at best, relying on questionable pieces of evidence. A cigarette butt, initially regarded as a breakthrough finding, was suddenly lost when investigators realized Morin wasn't a smoker. Mysterious red fibers, supposedly linking Christine to Guy-Paul's car, were presented. But an anonymous letter later revealed that the technician testing the fibers had been wearing a red sweater without a lab coat. And then there is the Morin family's account of Guy-Paul's late arrival home at 5:30 p.m. on October 3, 1984. They mentioned that he went on a detour for groceries and gas after work. The police planted an undercover officer named Gordon Hobbs in Morin's cell, who later claimed that Morin had confessed to stabbing Christine, stating that he would red rum the innocent. But Morin had a different story to tell. It was later revealed that Hobbs had engaged him in a conversation about movies, where he mentioned the iconic horror film The Shining as his favorite. Unable to recall the title, he resorted to referencing red rum. Was this a twisted plot by the police to extract a confession from an innocent man, or a deceitful plan of a killer to evade justice? The lines between truth and manipulation were rapidly blurring. Defying public expectations, he was acquitted of guilt, but another appeal was launched. So in the month of May 1990, a new trial unfolded. As the proceedings commenced, the evidence remained feeble. In fact, a lot of it had disappeared from the records of the Center of Forensic Sciences, including some of Christine's bones, vital notes, and a multitude of hair and fiber samples. On July 30th, 1992, the courtroom was packed with curious onlookers as Guy Paul Morin, the man accused of murdering young Christine Jessop, walked in for a second trial. His world was turned upside down as the gavel came down and the verdict was announced: guilty of first-degree murder. He couldn't believe it. "I'm not guilty of this crime. It's a travesty of justice what's happened today," he said.
And they said, look, just be easy on yourself and just let it out. It'll save your parents lots of dollars. It'll cost your parents within the 6-digit range. And how they were right about that.
Handcuffed and led away to the Elgin Middlesex Detention Center, he knew his life would never be the same. As the reality of his life sentence sank in, a surge of panic gripped him. Desperate for a breath of fresh air in his cell, he lay flat on the cold, hard floor, his mouth pressed against the narrow opening beneath the door, gasping for air. Morin's life behind bars was a constant battle for survival. Even the most notorious killers weren't kind to a murderer of an innocent child. So he had to be safely escorted to places. He found solace in the pages of books and the study of geography. His trial had already broken records as the longest and most expensive legal ordeal in Canadian history. But the end was nowhere in sight. With the advent of DNA technology, a glimmer of hope emerged for both the detectives and the defense lawyers involved in Guy Paul Morin's case. The detectives saw an opportunity to uncover additional evidence against him, while the defense lawyers understood the risk that the DNA evidence could potentially incriminate their client.
I'm in jail for the first time, and I'm being framed, and I have lawyers that feel it's hopeless. I know I'm innocent. Now, what am I supposed to do?
Morin, however, was desperate for the truth to be revealed and urged his legal team to proceed. He was also released on bail on February 9, 1993, thanks to the work of a grassroots organization called Justice for Guy Paul Morin Committee that was established to aid him in his search for exoneration. With his second appeal looming just days away, a bombshell announcement shattered the case. The DNA test results revealed that the bodily fluid found on Christine's underwear did not belong to Morin. Charges were dropped and his record was cleared. Along with the hefty compensation of $1.25 million, he also received a public apology for the wrongful accusation and conviction, which ruined his life. It was not until January 23, 1995, almost 10 years after he was first arrested, that Morin was exonerated as a result of the DNA testing that had not previously been available. The revelation was seismic and sent shockwaves through the entire community, who realized that not only had they sent an innocent man behind bars, but that the killer was still out there. But with no further leads in hand, the case soon turned cold. 35 years later, in the year 2019, Steve Smith, a detective with the Toronto Police Force, was ready for a change. He wanted to shift his focus to cold cases. As luck would have it, the Jessop case, a mystery that had haunted him for years, had been transferred to the Toronto Police. While attending a seminar at the Ontario Police College, Smith heard about the emerging field of forensic genealogy. It sounded like just what he needed to crack the Jessop case. A few months later, a genetic testing startup called Othram Inc. contacted him. They'd heard about his interest in the process and offered to help. The price tag of $1,800 seemed reasonable, and Smith wasted no time securing permission from Toronto police higher-ups. The possibility of using forensic genealogy in Canada had never been explored before. If it yielded no results, the tortured Jessop saga would endure yet another painful chapter. He submitted the DNA from Christine's underwear to Othram. The profile was updated to a database, GEDmatch, hoping for a break in the case. Smith eagerly awaited a golden goose match, a close relative of the killer. But the results that came back in December 2019 were nothing short of disastrous. There were only 2 matches, and they were so distant that building the family tree would involve at least 30,000 names. Smith persisted and got permission to run the DNA through a second database, Family Tree, which returned a few more matches, but still nothing close enough to identify the killer. With this progress, Smith and his team could narrow down the family tree to about 400 names. With the help of a genealogist, only known as James, who had over 3 decades of experience in the Toronto Police Department, and another genealogist from Othram, the team dove into a treasure trove of records, including burial and birth records, town registers, and social media. For 8 months, they tried to piece together a family tree that spanned generations. Finally, they were closing in on the real culprit. Their efforts eventually led them to a man named Henry Hoover Jr., who was born in 1804 in Lennox, Ontario. The suspect was part of his family line. But the work was far from over. They still had to trace the family tree down to the elusive culprit. Finally, they honed in on a single person, Calvin Hoover. The detectives had no idea that they were on the brink of encountering yet another twist in the tale.
We're learning more about the people that he spent time with, where he spent time, and we're looking at any unsolved cases that may be out there that Calvin could have been involved in.
Calvin Hoover was born in 1956 in Toronto Municipality in Ontario, Canada. In the mid-1970s, he met Heather, who'd traveled all the way from her native Newfoundland to Toronto. The two fell in love and got married, and Calvin became a stepfather to Heather's 2 boys. Soon after, they had 2 children of their own and rented a small home in a housing development just west of the Toronto Zoo in Oshawa. In 1984, Hoover was a 28-year-old tradesman. He held down steady employment, working for telecom companies like IBM's Rome Corporation and other firms. The man's career path was marked by constant company name changes, but his erratic behavior remained the same. He owned a 1980 gray Pontiac Phoenix. The Hoover family portrayed a perfect image. But beneath the surface, they were barely treading water, sinking deeper into debt with each passing day. Calvin Hoover had a taste for alcohol, gambling, and partying, leaving his family to struggle alone. Despite his charming demeanor outside, his family experienced his dark and cruel side. Heather, his wife, referred to him as a bit of a weirdo due to his erratic behavior. Hoover's burden of bankruptcy in 1991 was followed by unspoken struggles with anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorder. A DUI arrest in Ajax in 1996 ultimately shattered his carefully crafted facade of happy life, leading to a collapse of his marriage in 1997. Amidst the chaos, Hoover found solace in a new marriage to Joanne Jenny Roca in 2003. Hoover's life was already spiraling out of control when Jenny passed away from natural causes in 2009. Desperate and lost, Hoover began telling people in 2010 that he was contemplating taking his own life. His family and friends grew increasingly worried about him, and they even reached out to the police for help. He was spending his days as best he could. In 2015, he went on to live outside of Port Hope in a small bungalow with one of his sons. Prescribed tranquilizers had failed to alleviate his anxiety, so one day in his son's absence, Hoover resorted to taking his own life, sealing himself in the garage. He sat in a car and awaited the end as the generator hummed. He left behind a yellow sticky note with a farewell message that said, "Hope you all have a good life." Even after years of investigation that finally gave results, the detectives needed a direct DNA match to prove his guilt beyond doubt. With the discovery of 2 vials of Calvin Hoover's blood already available at the coroner's office, Detective Steve Smith was able to convince a judge to allow for genetic testing, a first in Ontario's history. The blood was entrusted to the capable hands of Kelly Bowie, a forensic scientist from Brampton, and her team at the Centre of Forensic Sciences. Finally, in October 2020, the results came in. The detectives held their breath for the answer, and it was a match. "I was in shock," Smith recalled. Christine's brother Ken considered it a miracle that the case was solved after all these years. With almost 4 decades having passed, the investigators made an attempt to piece the puzzle together with greater clarity than ever before. In the 1980s, at Eastern Independent Telecom, where wires connected businesses and communication flowed, a unique bond was forged between 2 families. Calvin and Heather were both employed at the company. Heather was a dispatcher, while Calvin was responsible for installations. Bob, Christine's father, led the charge as the lead installer. The Hoover and Jessop families started to socialize, often gathering for barbecues and birthdays. The moms became particularly close, with Janet playfully calling Heather the Goofy Newfie. Heather would often babysit Christine, who referred to her as Auntie Heather. Despite the physical distance of about 50 kilometers that separated their homes, Janet and Heather made it a point to meet regularly. On April 1, 1984, 2 days before Christine went missing, Janet drove her kids to Hoover's house. With her husband in jail, life had become a juggling act of childcare, work, and visits to the prison. But as she chatted with her close friend Heather, little did she know that her words would prove to be a fatal mistake. Unbeknownst to Janet, Calvin Hoover overheard her mention that she'd be visiting Bob in jail in 2 days and that Christine was too young to accompany her. The opportunity to strike would have been too tempting for him. As Janet left the Hoover residence, she had no idea that her innocent comment would set off a chain of events that would lead to the disappearance of her beloved daughter. And as she drove home, Calvin Hoover was already plotting his next move, knowing that he had a small window of opportunity to carry out his twisted plan. As the school bus pulled away on October 3, 1984, leaving the quiet street behind, Calvin Hoover revved the engine of his car and waited for his moment. He'd been waiting for this opportunity for days, biding his time until the perfect moment presented itself. Did he approach her with a smile and a friendly wave, luring her into the car with promises of seeing her father? Or did he use force, snatching her up in his arms and carrying her kicking and screaming to the car? There isn't a way to know that for sure. But what we do know is that by 4:10 p.m., Christine was in Calvin's car, hurtling down the road towards a fate that no one could have imagined. At only 40 pounds, Christine wouldn't have been a match for the full-grown man behind the wheel. Everyone was grappling with the question of why her body had been found in a remote, desolate area of Sunderland, miles away from her hometown of Queensville. Yet there was a hidden connection, known only to Calvin Hoover. He had a friend who lived just a few kilometers from that very spot. They shared a love of kayaking and backcountry camping, and Calvin knew the area like the back of his hand. He'd found the perfect place to hide his horrific crime, where he could go unnoticed and undisturbed. As Calvin Hoover went about his daily life, trying to bury the dark secrets of his past, his wife Heather held on to a haunting reminder of the little girl he'd taken from them. A photo Christine had given her, capturing her sweet smile and innocent nature, was kept in a prominent spot as a constant reminder of what had been lost. Meanwhile, Hoover put on a facade of empathy and concern, offering words of comfort and support to his wife. He had successfully evaded the grasp of law enforcement for an astonishing 36 years. His audacity knew no bounds as he played the role of an innocent helper in the search for young Christine Jessop when she initially vanished. But Hoover's sinister game didn't stop there. He shamelessly attended Christine's wake, mingling among grieving friends and family members. 3 separate police forces, York, Durham, and Toronto, tirelessly pursued the truth, their investigations intertwining in a desperate race to uncover the killer. Yet Hoover remained one step ahead, owing all to his good luck. He would have silently watched as the media frenzy surrounding Christine Jessop's murder unfolded. As investigators combed through countless leads in the Christine Jessop case, his name kept showing up in the case files that seemed purely irrelevant. Heather was asked about his whereabouts, and she had initially told the officers that her husband was working that day. But she later realized that he'd been busy taking care of their children at home instead. However, Calvin was never cross-questioned. The revelation left a shockwave of emotions in its wake, with even those remotely connected to the case feeling the aftershocks. Calvin Hoover's family was devastated after learning about the details. His ex-wife Heather was stunned that she'd spent years with someone capable of such heinous acts.
Shared exclusively with CBC on behalf of her family, she says, "Our hearts go out to the Jessop family. We ask for privacy at this time while we all come to terms with this horrendous news that was as shocking to us as it was to the Jessop family."
And grappled with whether to reach out to the Jessops. Haunted by the trial and grisly crime scene, memories plagued the detectives like lingering ghosts. Bernie Fitzpatrick carried a burden of guilt and remorse for the mistakes made during the investigation. He said, "I feel bad about it, but look, the cops pick up the rocks. It's the attorneys who break the windows." Ken Jessop, Christine's brother, described the family's journey through the 7 stages of grief, from disbelief to hope.
It's over now. The end has come, and we have now some closure, and that was very, very important to get, and get the right closure.
Bob had remarried over the years, but was still burdened by his daughter's unsolved murder. Learning of Hoover's DNA match unleashed a surge of anger.
So that was the unknown thing at the time, and unbelievable to a degree as to why he would even do it.
He said, "If I could, I'd line him up and blow his brains out." Whereas Guy Paul Morin still faced challenges finding employment and acceptance despite his exoneration. Enrolling his son in a nearby kindergarten school just brought outrage over his past. The school administration immediately told Morin that his son was no longer welcome. Despite the hardships, the latest update in the investigation brought a sense of vindication. He said that he always believed that DNA would eventually reveal the true killer.
My DNA, the scientists, I commemorate them 100%, knowing that they did a beautiful job. The scientists, they exonerated me.
As Guy Paul Morin, now a free man, visited Christine's grave for the first time, he softly whispered the words, "Rest in peace there, little girl." Before the wheels of justice could catch up with Calvin Hoover, he became his own victim when he met his end, leaving behind a trail of shattered lives and unanswered questions. Among his victims was Christine, Guy Paul Morin, thousands of Queensville residents who forgot what safety felt like, and even himself. With his own life extinguished, Hoover evaded the true consequences of his heinous deeds, leaving behind a haunting reminder that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. While the pain and trauma of this case will never be fully healed, the resolution of the case brought a sense of peace and closure to those affected by the tragedy. On the morning of February 23, 2008, firefighters responded to this 911 call.
911, Lake County Sheriff.
I think my garage is on fire. I just heard some noise, and I opened the door, and it's all black smoke.
After battling the blaze, they waited to assess the damage. But as the smoke cleared, they discovered more than they bargained for. Pinned beneath the truck was the charred body of 39-year-old Ari Squire.
It appeared the truck had slipped off the front jack, and it had crushed the victim.
What looked to be an open and shut accidental house fire case was about to turn into an investigation riddled with shocking twists and turns. A case so surreal that it was made for a true crime series. But what exactly caused the fire? And why was no one aware that someone had been trapped in the garage? Surrounded by beautiful lakes and lush forests, Lake Barrington, a suburb in Chicago, Illinois, is considered one of the best places to live. With a population of just over 5,000, it makes Lake Barrington the 327th largest city in Illinois and 4,775th in the United States overall. It offers one the perfect blend of countryside living with modern amenities. In February 2008, though, the tranquility of the community was rocked by a murder mystery like no other. It's one that still dominates the gossip grapevines of the community. It was a quiet Saturday morning on February 23, 2008, when 46-year-old Denise Squire heard 3 loud bangs coming from the garage. She quickly made her way to the door connecting the house to the garage. Opening the door, she saw that the garage had been engulfed in smoke and flame. Fearing the entire house might catch fire, she ran back into her kitchen and dialed 911 to ask for help.
911, Lake County Sheriff.
I think my garage is on fire. I just heard some noise and I opened the door and it's all black smoke.
And there's smoke coming from your garage?
Should I go outside or what do I do?
Wait outside where it's safe, okay?
Still shaken, she waited outside as firefighters arrived and began fighting back the blaze that had begun in the garage. When the fire was finally put out, firemen entered the garage to investigate the cause of the blaze. There was a heavy smell of diesel fuel in the air. But the shocking part was yet to come. Pinned beneath a large truck was a charred body. The men rushed to lift the truck off the body. The firemen on the scene knew they had to call in the police department, as this was a crime scene. When investigators arrived along with a forensics team, they looked over the body discovered in the fire. The upper half of the body had been burned beyond recognition, but the man's lower body seemed untouched. They searched his pant pockets and discovered a wallet with identification. The man lying beneath the truck turned out to be 39-year-old Ari Squire, Denise's husband. Ari Squire was born on November 10, 1968, in Chicago, Illinois. Not much has been reported about his early life or his family. In 1994, Ari met and married Denise, who was a former professor at the National Louis University. In the course of their 14-year marriage, Ari began working in the building industry. He'd started a thriving construction company along with his friend and business partner, Joseph Vaccaro. Ari was well known around the area of Lake Barrington and Arlington Heights, which is also a suburb in Chicago in neighboring Cook County. He made friends easily because of his outgoing and chatty personality. But his personal life had started to show strain. In their 14-year-long marriage, Ari and Denise never had any children. Instead, Ari took up the hobby of diesel truck pulling, an obscure sport within the Chicago area. He built himself a large garage on their property and invested much of his time and money into the hobby. In turn, he neglected his relationship with Denise.
They did not sleep in the same bed. When I did get to the house, I did see that it was obvious that both beds had been slept in that night.
It wasn't really a close-knit marriage. That was coming out very clearly.
Investigators were about to discover that it was more than just his marriage that his hobby had consumed. As investigators and forensic teams looked through the crime scene, they began to notice discrepancies within the theory of the accident. The initial reports from firefighters suggested that Ari had been working on the fuel filter when the jack holding up the truck broke or slipped. In the process, Ari had been crushed and the diesel had spilled over his body. The light he'd been using was also smashed and left exposed. They surmised that the open spark and the flammable diesel caused the fire that burned his body and grew out of control. Investigators were quick to point out that the circuit breakers were all switched off.
Checking out all the circuits on those, I noticed that they were all in the off position.
When they asked firefighters about this, the men said that they'd not touched anything in the garage.
I inquired whether the fire department had indeed, turned those off. They said no, they hadn't touched the circuit box at all.
It was an immediate red flag for investigators who couldn't figure out how the fire could start if the power in the garage was turned off.
Some red flags were going off, I think, for our detective bureau, certainly.
It was consistent with like a gasoline type, which would have been more of a lighter petroleum product.
They also noticed that the fire had been contained to the area where the body was found. There'd been no damage anywhere else other than on the body and the immediate area around it. Investigators grew suspicious and pushed for the body to be sent for an autopsy and testing to determine what had caused the fire. In the meantime, investigators questioned Denise Squire. They were curious about her cold reaction upon hearing of her husband's accidental death. She also didn't seem to know much about Ari and his life. Denise nonchalantly provided investigators with scant details about Ari, including the possibility that he may have an American flag tattooed on his shoulder. But everyone grieves differently, and this was not a reason to make her a suspect. Investigators, though, had a sneaking suspicion that some kind of foul play may have occurred, but did not know who may have been responsible. As suspicion falls on the spouse in incidents such as this, Denise was questioned as a person of interest. They soon discovered that Denise and Ari did not share a very close relationship. Their marriage had disintegrated over the years. As one team of investigators questioned Denise, another was able to discover that Ari had life insurance for the value of $5 million.
So we began to try to find out why the wife would not know these details concerning Ari.
The sole beneficiary was Denise. During a follow-up questioning, Denise claimed to have no idea about any life insurance that Ari may have had. Without solid proof or evidence that would link her to the crime, police had no option but to allow her to leave. It was still just a theory that she may be involved, not actual fact. Based on all the circumstantial evidence, Ari Squire was pronounced dead. But for insurance purposes, an official autopsy had to be conducted. Unable to lift fingerprints of the body or positively identify him by facial markers or distinguishing birthmarks or tattoos, the medical examiner turned to dental science. He made a plaster cast of Ari's teeth and made note of any defects or dental work performed. The process was going to take a while. This meant a delay in releasing the body. However, Denise was about to create even more suspicion just 3 days after the death of her husband. Denise had been calling the police and the medical examiner's office in order to have Ari's body released. Her explanation was that she needed to have his remains cremated and hold a memorial ceremony for him. This request was denied, but it deepened the suspicions of investigators. Firstly, they were surprised that Denise suddenly showed such concern for her husband when she had seemed disconnected during questioning. Secondly, they couldn't understand why she needed his remains in order to hold a memorial service. And thirdly, surely she understood that it was now a criminal investigation and all investigative protocols needed to be followed. Nevertheless, Denise went ahead and held a memorial for Ari at a local Italian eatery. But the twist in the case was about to turn the investigation on its head. It was so surreal that it left everyone close to the investigation speechless. In the week following Ari's death, the coroner was finally able to track down Ari's dental records. He'd not been to a dentist in over 10 years, so there was no x-ray available to compare the dental plaster cast. However, once they got hold of the records, a surprising detail popped up. Ari had done a number of fillings on his teeth years earlier, but the remains of the man discovered in the fire had no dental work performed on him. His teeth were all healthy and untouched.
We were able to track down that dentist in California after some phone calls.
The case was about to take an entirely new turn. What seemed to be a straightforward accidental death case now turned into a homicide investigation.
The body that they had, the burned body, was not Ari Squire's.
If it's not Ari Squire, who is it? And why are they underneath there?
But the question remained, who was the victim? And where was Ari Squire? Investigators widened their search area and decided to look into any missing persons reports made in the recent weeks. It was then they made a startling discovery. On February 25, 2008, just 2 days after the murder, a woman named Donna Fiorito had filed a missing persons report for her 20-year-old son, Justin Newman. Investigators followed up with this information and decided to pay Donna a visit on February 29, 2008. They were about to uncover some very interesting information. Justin Newman was born on January 20th, 1988 in Arlington Heights, Chicago. He was raised by a single mother, Donna Fiorito, and had an older half-brother named Frank. Justin was described as a good kid who knew his responsibilities. He started working at an early age in order to help his mother pay the bills. He was the type of boy who made sure he took care of things for his mother, including dropping her off and picking her up from work. He was working at the Home Depot in Arlington Heights at the time of his disappearance. According to Donna, he'd met someone who offered him a better-paying job, and Justin was excited about the opportunity.
He told me he had met a man that comes into Home Depot quite often, and he had pulled Justin aside and asked Justin if he'd like to make more money. So Justin said, yeah, that sounds good, you know.
When Donna mentioned Ari Squires, the person who contacted Justin about the job, interest in the case was heightened. Donna then said that when he failed to return home to take her to work, she knew something was wrong. Her suspicions grew even more when he didn't return home and only sent her a text message the next day. Donna contacted the police 2 days after Justin disappeared.
Justin doesn't text, you know, because that wasn't Justin. He would pick up the phone and call me. There was no way he would text me.
Armed with this information, investigators put out an all-points bulletin for police officers from other jurisdictions to be on the lookout for Justin Newman and his car. Investigators questioned Donna further about Justin and about any identifying marks he may have on his body. Donna told investigators that Justin had a J tattooed on his forearm. They then explained the situation involving a body being discovered at a fire at Ari Squires' home and the victim being an unknown male. Investigators then took one of Justin's toothbrushes and a DNA sample from Donna to perform testing against the profile they had of the unknown male. For Donna, though, she already had a sinking feeling as to what the answer was going to be. The case had already taken a very dark twist as investigators discovered the body may belong to someone else. But as investigators in Chicago were gathering up information to finally uncover the mystery of the burnt body, police officers in Eureka, Missouri made another startling discovery. On March 2, 2008, a police officer who was verifying number plates in the area came across a red car in the parking lot of a Days Inn motel.
The motel's not your typical family motel. It was more of a run-down type motel.
The officer noticed the number plate of the car was breaking off. He suspected the car may have been stolen. When he put the details of the number plate in the system, he found it registered to a Justin Newman from Arlington Heights. He checked in with the motel receptionist that confirmed a person by that name had checked in on February 23, 2008. The officer was about to discover there was more to the story than met the eye. As part of their job, they needed to file all work for the day. As he filed away his reports on the number plate, he discovered that Justin Newman had been reported missing on February 25, 2008. There was more added to the report on February 29, 2008. Justin was wanted for questioning with regard to an apparent homicide in Lake Barrington, Chicago. The officer decided to move in on the suspect who was wanted for questioning. It was time to confront Justin Newman. Making his way to room 213, the officer stood outside, listening carefully. He knocked and announced himself, but there was no response. He knocked a second time, a little louder, but before he could get an answer, a loud bang resounded.
Before he can get through the door, a loud gunshot.
It was the sound of a single gunshot. The police officer broke down the door and entered the room. There, he found a man lying dead on the bed with a single gunshot wound to the head. He then called for backup and a forensics team to examine the crime scene. A sweep of the crime scene revealed startling details. Inside, they found Justin's identity card and wallet. The man on the bed resembled Justin. He had blue eyes and brown hair. However, police discovered a bottle of brown hair dye in the bathroom. Upon further investigation, they looked at the man's forearms. From what information they had about Justin, the man on the bed had no J tattoo. Police were about to discover yet another twist in the case that had already left many scratching their heads. On a hunch, they pulled back his shirt sleeve and found an American flag tattoo. It was where Denise Squire said that Ari had a tattoo. Missouri authorities contacted Chicago investigators to report the incident. Both police departments launched a joint investigation immediately. It wasn't difficult to link both crime scenes. From the interview with Donna, they knew that Justin and Ari had known each other, but the reason for the entire murder plot was still a mystery. No one was prepared for what they were about to learn. The entire case was once again going to take an even darker twist. Investigators looked deeply into Ari and Denise Squire's background, while the investigation into Justin's disappearance and Ari's death continued. They discovered that Ari and Denise had been on the verge of financial ruin. Ari had pleaded guilty to Medicare fraud back in 2007. He was fined $63,000. These charges stemmed from a case with a company he owned called AccuCare that had made false medical aid claims and received money. In 2000 and 2001, Ari had run another Medicare scheme. He'd failed to file cost reports for his company and was charged with fraud. He was ordered to pay in excess of $126,000 for the fraudulent claims and a further $200,000 in legal fees. His overall debt had been compounded over the years while he continued to live a rather lavish lifestyle. But things only got worse after the housing market crash in the mid-2000s. Ari's construction company was not performing well, and a new apartment block project in Florida had tanked in late 2007. Faced with financial ruin, Ari concocted a plan to cash out on his $5 million insurance policy. But the plot was about to thicken even more. Soon after the discovery of Ari Squire's body at the Days Inn Motel in Missouri, DNA results were able to prove that the man who had been burned in the garage was Justin Newman. DNA also proved that Ari was in fact the man who ended his own life. When news reports of the crime began to surface, investigators were in for yet another surprise. The new twist in the case was about to blow the case open and leave everyone questioning what they knew. A man named Sandy Lively came forward to investigators and told them about how Ari Squire had promised him a job with a higher salary.
I think that he had plans for me, and I blew his plan that day. I think about it every day and all day sometimes. That comes and goes.
Sandy admitted that he was surprised by what the job application entailed, but didn't really let it bother him. But be it fate, Sandy was unable to meet with Ari. Investigators found evidence that revealed Sandy was the original target for Ari's fake death plot. It was an eerie discovery. Ari had singled out Sandy, who shared a striking resemblance with him and was also closer to his own age. They also noted Ari had started to grow a beard weeks before the intended murder, when he had never done so in his life. Ari had been seen by several staff members in the weeks building up to the murder, speaking to both Justin and Sandy. Even though Sandy shared a closer resemblance to Ari, Justin too had a similar build and stature. Investigators believe that after Sandy had failed to show up for the intended meeting, Ari moved to his backup plan. He offered Justin a job with a minimum hourly wage of $15. On Saturday morning, February 23, 2008, Ari contacted Justin to arrange a meeting at his home. After entering the garage, they believe he was knocked out by Ari using chloroform, as there were no signs of blunt force trauma to his head. Ari then stripped Justin and changed clothes with him before placing his wallet in the pants pocket. Thereafter, he placed Justin on the creeper and rolled him under the truck. After that, Ari released the jack, which caused the truck to fall and crush Justin to death. He then poured extra diesel and another accelerant in order to burn the body so that investigators could not identify him. Ari then stole Justin's identity and car before making his way to Eureka, Missouri. Following news of his death, he sent Justin's mother, Donna, a message to say Justin had gone to Missouri. He then planned to cash out on the life insurance policy through his wife, Denise, in order to avoid filing for bankruptcy and having to settle other legal fees. He intended to live out his life by assuming Justin's identity and remaining a free man. These plans, however, failed after police had shown up at his motel room and Ari took his own life. For months, investigators continued to work to close the case. Armed with the knowledge of Ari's financial background and a working theory of how Ari put his plan together, investigators knocked on Denise's door again. When asked how much she knew about the fire and the murder, Denise denied outright that she was involved. This time, though, investigators were a step ahead. They had been keeping a close watch on Denise and discovered sketchy emails. The emails they traced had been sent from Ari himself on February 24th, a day after he faked his own death. It instructed Denise as to where he'd left his last will and documents. 5 days later, another string of email conversations was recovered. These read as follows: "Did an accident happen?" To which she replied, "Yes." He then asks, "Per my will, when is the party set for?" To which she replies, "Working on that now." Ari then asked her what she wanted, and she responded by saying a new life. Investigators believe that this was enough proof that Denise willingly assisted her husband in the murder for an insurance plot. She claimed that the emails were not dated and that she believes Ari had set them up to be sent automatically upon his death. Her lawyers have held up this claim and state that she had no idea of Ari's plans. No charges were ever filed against Denise, and according to reports, she continues to live in Chicago, but has changed back to her maiden surname. Denise, however, did not receive any compensation following her husband's death due to the suicide clause written into the insurance policy. Following the investigation and the closing of the case, Justin's mother Donna and his half-brother Frank filed a wrongful death case against Denise Squire. In February 2010, the case went to trial. After 4 days of deliberation and after hearing arguments from the lawyer representing Donna and Frank, the jury decided to award Justin's family a payout of $6 million. Reports have surfaced that Justin's family have only received $1.3 million in payment. There's not been any more news on whether Denise was able to fulfill the promised payment. For Donna, though, the money can't heal the wound. She still suffers with depression following the death of her son. At a news conference after the trial, she told reporters that she often thought about her son and what he would say. "I just thought about Justin, and I looked at his picture and pictured what he'd say to me. He'd say, 'Mom, you know what? This is ridiculous. I'm gone. I'm not coming back. Get up and go do something,' she said." The lawyer for the family stated that Justin was a good kid who was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Donna can't help but believe that Ari was a coward looking for a way out. The case of Justin Newman and Ari Squire was one of many terrible twists and turns. In the end, Ari Squire not only took the life of an innocent young man, but created upheaval in the lives of those he left behind. So today, we ask you about your thoughts on the case. Do you believe that Ari and Denise truly conspired to get the insurance money? Or was Denise an unfortunate pawn in the entire scheme? It should have been a short walk to the gym and back for 13-year-old Yara Gambirasio on the evening of November 26, 2010. When she failed to make curfew or answer any of her mother's frantic calls, her family contacted the police. No one could have predicted the young girl's disappearance would begin one of Italy's most expensive manhunts and captivate a nation so deeply. It would become one of Italy's most complex investigations to date. But where was Yara? What happened that made the responsible young girl vanish into thin air? Sandwiched between the rivers of Brembo and Adda, Brambate di Sopra in the Bergamo province of Italy is a calm rural municipality. Boasting medieval architecture set against a background of cypress and poplar trees as far as the eye can see, one could be forgiven for believing they've been transferred into a fairy tale. The close-knit community is filled with people that are welcoming but also private in nature. It's a family town that places great stock in peaceful living and tradition. The entire landscape is family-friendly and encourages an active outdoor lifestyle. One could get lost in the aura of natural beauty and the serenity of the town. But in 2010, the community of Brambate de Sopra was thrown headfirst into a case that not only gripped the community, but the entire nation as well. This was the disappearance of Yara Gambirasio. Yara Gambirasio was born on May 21, 1997, to parents Fluvio and Mora Gambirasio. She was raised alongside her older sister Keba and two younger brothers Nathan and Giole. Her father worked on construction sites as an architect across the Bergamo province, while her mother was a school teacher at a local school. Yara was raised in a modest home, and the values of love, respect, and responsibility were instilled in her at an early age. As the years passed and Yara grew, she began to embody the traditions her parents passed down to their 4 children. While growing up, Yara began taking an interest in rhythmic gymnastics and was part of the school team. They often trained at the local sports center that was about 700 meters from their family home. At the end of November 2010, 13-year-old Yara was looking forward to the following Sunday, December 5th, as she and her team were competing in a regional gymnastics competition. On the Friday evening of November 26, 2010, Yara left home at 5:15 p.m. and promised her mother that she'd be back in time for supper by 6:45 p.m. She'd taken a stereo from home to lend to her gym instructor, Silvia Brenna, before walking the usual route to the sports center. While there, she did some light training in preparation for the upcoming gymnastics competition. She then left around 6:44 p.m. and began making her way home as promised. Yara, however, never returned home. Mora watched as the clock ticked by, and by 7 p.m., Yara had still not returned from the gym. Growing increasingly worried, Mora and her husband Fluvio tried to reason that maybe their daughter had just gotten distracted and forgot the time. At around 7:11 p.m., Mora tried to call Yara's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. This was uncharacteristic behavior for Yara. They called the gym instructor, who said that Yara had left over half an hour ago. This sent Yara's parents into a state of panic, and both Fluvio and Mora went out on the streets to look for her, but there was nothing. By 7:30 p.m., they were convinced something bad had happened and called the police to report Yara missing. Letizia Ruggeri was the magistrate on duty, and she took on the case immediately. Within minutes of taking the call, she dispatched both state police and the Carabinieri, the military police, to begin the search. The first thing police did was retrace the steps of Yara. A few people who were interviewed said they saw Yara talking to 2 men near a red car in the parking lot, but this lead fizzled out quickly. The community joined in, and hundreds of people participated in a search that lasted the entire night, despite the cold autumn weather. There was just no trace of Yara. Ruggeri had been working from her office in the meantime. She'd been able to procure Yara's cell phone records and bloodhounds that were going to be used to track Yara's scent within the week. By now, the media had gotten wind of the situation in Brambate de Sopra and were starting to swarm the area, latching onto every bit of information. As the week dragged on and police sifted through what information they had, Ruggeri and her team questioned the Gambirasio family. Their line of questioning focused on anything that could have happened at home that triggered Yara and caused her to possibly run away. They learned nothing useful. Ruggeri then proposed an elaborate plan to have wiretaps put on hundreds of phones in the region, including that of the Gambirasio family home. This was in the hope of hearing some incriminating information that could lead to Yara's abductor. The team also tried to trace the nearly 15,000 phones that passed through the town on the day of November 26, 2010. Having searched through Yara's cell phone records, they discovered that she'd sent a text message to a friend at 6:44 p.m. The text confirmed a meeting time for them to travel to the gymnastics competition the following Sunday. It was immediately ruled out that Yara disappeared voluntarily, as she'd been making plans for the next week. This was further backed up by the recordings of the wiretaps placed in Yara's home. The family had a strong bond and no dark secrets or history of discord that would cause Yara to run away from home. Another surprising discovery was that Yara's phone had pinged off a tower in a nearby hamlet called Mapello, at 6:49 p.m. on the evening she disappeared. This proved that Yara had moved in the opposite direction of her home. The tracker dogs that were brought in, after sniffing through Yara's belongings, shot off in the direction of Mapello, confirming her travel in that direction. There, they stopped at a construction site, one familiar to Yara's father Fluvio. He'd once worked at the site as an architect. Although no sign of Yara was found, it confirmed that she'd been here or either kept here at some point during her disappearance. Police then worked on the theory that Yara's father may have been the target of disgruntled employees. But despite looking at this angle, there was no solid evidence to support the lead. However, the investigation was about to take another turn as a promising lead presented itself. While listening in on various wiretaps placed on the hundreds of cell phones in the town, investigators finally got their first tangible lead. A translator intercepted a strange and revealing phrase in late November 2010. The man speaking on the phone had said, "Forgive me, God, I didn't kill her." Police were stumped and immediately began searching for the owner of the cell phone. They were able to trace the call to a man named Mohammed Fikri. After putting together the pieces, they discovered that Fikri was a Moroccan man living in the Bergamo province. But that was only the beginning of their discovery. He was also a construction worker at the site in Mapello, the same one that the tracker dogs had led police to. But it had almost been too late. By the time police discovered his whereabouts, Fikri had already boarded a ferry to Tangiers. On December 4th, 2010, Italian authorities were able to intercept the boat and arrested Fikri for the abduction of Yara. It was a relief to the Italian public and the police. They had their suspect. The van that Fikri had been using was found, and a blood-stained mattress was discovered in the back. In custody, Fikri denied his involvement and proclaimed his innocence. He explained that the blood belonged to him and that his ticket was purchased back in May 2010. He also said that the translator misinterpreted the phrase. The nation was in for a shock. Many had prayed that Yara would be found before the festive season in December 2010. However, their collective hopes were dashed. The suspect they believed would lead them to Yara turned out to be a false lead. The translator did indeed misunderstand what was being said. Fikri had planned to leave Bergamo since May 2010, and the blood on the mattress did not match Yara at all. Fikri was released, and investigators were back to square one. As the days turned into weeks and autumn passed into winter, the Gambirasio family retreated deeper into their shell. They were a private family by nature, and the sudden interest in Yara's disappearance shook their quiet world. Rather than hold a torchlight procession to promote the search for Yara, the family opted to hold a mass for her safe return. A few days after their first Christmas without Yara, the Gambirasio family gave a rare television interview. In the interview, they asked for privacy and patience from reporters as the search for Yara continued. They had placed their faith in the police and prosecutor Ruggeri in finding Yara well and alive. They also shared several different photos of Yara that could be used and distributed in the media to jog any witness memories. Fluvio made a plea to the media to help them return to normalcy amid the chaos and said that their family values were built on love, respect, and honesty. He then said they would not be giving interviews. But Christmas had passed without any news, and then the new year came in with a bang. Still, there was no sign of Yara despite the extensive searches being conducted and the obsession of a country that was gripped by the young girl's disappearance. Exactly 3 months later, on February 26, 2011, a new development in the case would arise. It was not something the Gambirasio family or the Italian public wanted to hear. In the small town of Cignolo di Zola, some 10 kilometers south of Brambate di Sopra, the case was about to take a tragic turn. While out flying one of his remote-controlled airplanes, middle-aged Ilario Scotti was about to make a shocking discovery as he landed the craft which had been giving him some problems. When he went to retrieve the craft, he noticed some rags among the tall grass. Then he noticed the shoes. Scotti called the police immediately. Arriving at the scene, police were sure that they were going to make a disturbing discovery that was about to change their missing persons investigation into a homicide investigation. Prosecutor Letizia Ruggeri was called to the scene. When she arrived, it did not take long for them to positively identify the remains of 13-year-old Yara Gambirasio. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition. She was still wearing her black bomber jacket, Hello Kitty sweatshirt, and black leggings. Near her body, they found her iPod, house keys, and the SIM card to her phone, along with a phone battery. There was no phone, though. Yara's body was taken to the coroner's office, and the autopsy was conducted by renowned forensic pathologist, Professor Cristina Cattaneo. The results of her examination yielded a wealth of forensic evidence. Yara had not been assaulted despite her bra being unhooked. She'd suffered several stab wounds, but nothing fatal. She'd also been hit on the head, which possibly rendered her unconscious. Her cause of death was labeled as exposure to the cold, which led to hypothermia. Trace amounts of lime were found in Yara's respiratory system, and the presence of jute, a vegetable fiber used to make rope, was found on Yara's clothing. They also discovered 2 DNA samples on Yara's phone battery and on 2 of the fingers of her black gloves. The DNA samples, though, did not provide any matches. What Professor Cattaneo could provide was that whoever was responsible for the abduction and murder of Yara had worked in the construction industry due to the trace amounts of lime and jute from the crime scene. It had seemed that the investigation had hit another dead end. But forensics was about to uncover another clue. It took another 2 months before a new lead was found. In April 2011, a forensic scientist discovered a trace amount of DNA on Yara's leggings and underwear. The sample was tested, and an unknown male DNA profile was developed. Ruggeri received the call that told her the murder now had a signature. The profile was given the code name of Ignoto 1, or Unknown 1. Although they now had a DNA profile to work with, Italy had not developed a DNA database with which police could test the profile against. Ruggeri was about to make a decision that was going to make Yara's case one of the most expensive and laborious tasks ever undertaken in Italian history. The search for Unknown 1 was about to begin in earnest. Prosecutor Ruggeri divided up the task force. The local police were tasked with collecting DNA samples from family members, friends of the family and Yara, and everyone at the gym. The military police were tasked with tracking down all the phone users who had moved between Brambate di Sopra to Cignolo di Zola. Thereafter, they were to track down each individual and collect their DNA samples for testing. Ruggeri then turned to the area where Yara's body was discovered and tasked another team with tracking down the list of members who frequented the nightclub Sabi Mobili. The nightclub had a reputation for violence, and Ruggeri was sure the person responsible for killing Yara may have either frequented the club or known the place well enough to leave her body there. By the end of the campaign, the police had amassed over 15,000 DNA samples. Geneticists from Parma, Pavia, and Rome worked tirelessly to transform the simple DNA samples into something investigators could work with in order to find the elusive Unknown 1. As April dragged into May and the days grew hotter, the search for a DNA match grew wider. Yara's family and close friends were cleared after their samples did not match the profile. The investigation continued, and Yara's body was released to her family. On May 28, 2011, 6 months after Yara's disappearance, large crowds of onlookers lined the streets as Yara's white coffin was transported by hearse to the sports center where she'd spent countless hours training. The crowds watched on a big screen set up outside the sports center as the Gambirasio family said their final emotional goodbyes. President of the Republic, Giorgio Napolitano, also sent his condolences to the family, and the recording was broadcast at the funeral. The procession then left for the burial of Yara at the Cimitero de Brambate di Sopra, where she was interred between her grandparents. It was adorned with a simple headstone showing a picture of Yara smiling, with her signature engraved in the stone. Ruggeri, in the meanwhile, was getting flack from the politicians and public alike for her extensive use of resources and lack of success in trying to identify the killer. But in a surprising turn of events, Ruggeri's hunch to test for DNA samples from those who frequented the nightclub, Sabi Mobili, had paid off. One of the clubgoers' DNA samples was strikingly similar to that of Unknown 1. They closed in on the man and had brought him in for questioning in June 2011. His name was Damiano Guerinoni. However, he was quickly exonerated. For one, he was in South America at the time of Yara's disappearance. Secondly, his DNA showed that although the sample was similar, it was not a 100% match. It was surmised that Damiano was not the killer, but was related to unknown one. Upon further questioning, detectives made yet another shocking discovery. Damiano's mother, Aurora Zani, had been a domestic worker for the Gambirasio family for over 10 years. Investigators interviewed both Aurora and Damiano and closely surveyed the family. Calls were intercepted and the family were grilled extensively. DNA samples were taken from all the family members, but the results were not a 100% match. In the end, the connection between the family of Damiano and Yara proved to be a crazy coincidence. Their case had hit yet another dead end, and investigators only had the possible lead that Damiano was somehow related to unknown one. Ruggeri faced overwhelming criticism for her failure to produce a positive result despite her extensive investigation. As pressure mounted, she continued to work behind the scenes and focused on finding a link between Damiano and unknown one. They further questioned Damiano about his family and possible relations to people in and around Bergamo. Ruggeri's team began developing a family tree for the Guerinonis. For the next few months, they traced the family's genealogical tree as far back as the year 1716. From there, they found names and addresses, dates of birth, and places of birth. It led them back to a small village named Grono, a 45-minute drive from Bergamo. It was within this maze of names that they finally found a clue. Damiano had a paternal uncle named Giuseppe Guerinoni. Yet again, investigators were sure that they were on the right track and were finally going to put a name to unknown one. They were in for another hurdle. Giuseppe had passed away 11 years earlier in 1999. In September 2011, investigators visited Laura Poli, the widow of Giuseppe. Here they questioned his widow and were able to retrieve DNA from 2 postage stamps he'd licked. One from a postcard he'd sent to family and another from his license, which he needed to have validated. The DNA was sent for testing, and what investigators were about to learn was going to take the investigation onto another level. Giuseppe's DNA was a 50% match to unknown one's DNA profile. That proved that Giuseppe was likely the father of the unknown one. Investigators knew that Giuseppe had been married and fathered 3 children, a girl and 2 boys. Since the DNA was that of an unknown male, both his sons, Pierpaolo and Diego, were tested. However, investigators hit another hurdle. Neither of the boys matched the DNA profile, and neither of them had any children for detectives to test further. Left scratching their heads, investigators were stumped as to how the DNA profile matched perfectly with Giuseppe, but not with his sons. This left investigators to come to one conclusion. Giuseppe had fathered another child, either from a previous relationship or out of wedlock. Upon further questioning, Laura insisted that Giuseppe had only been married to her and had not engaged in extramarital affairs. But investigators did not take her word for it and began looking into Giuseppe's past. It was a battle of wills for investigators. The people of the region were private and did not entertain the possibility of affairs within the area. But interviews with those who knew Giuseppe and worked with him proved that he was a known ladies' man, and there was a possibility he could have fathered another child. The investigation was about to unearth some well-hidden secrets that had long ago been buried. They looked into the life of Giuseppe Guerinoni. From 1960, Giuseppe was known to frequent a spa resort south of Milan without his wife for 2 weeks every May. Ruggeri's team tracked the records of the spa and searched for women who were single mothers. They also scoured through various orphanages in the area and began DNA testing on suspected children of Giuseppe. These tests, however, came up empty-handed. When this failed, they then turned to the possibility that the woman they were looking for may have been married and raised the children without telling her husband of her infidelity. The investigation was kept under tight wraps as it was becoming highly sensitive given the angle that they were now looking at. Marshal Giovanni Mossolini, who was Ruggeri's right-hand man in the investigation, began following up on his own leads. The Gambirasio family had also in the meantime hired their own geneticist to investigate and provide them with details and explanations of the case. He was able to exhume and retrieve DNA from the remains of Giuseppe that yet again proved that he was the father of Unknown One, but with a stronger sample. By March 2013, the investigation had reached a heated climax. The press got wind of the investigation, and it became known that Giuseppe had fathered a child out of wedlock. The exhumed remains and DNA extracted proved undoubtedly that Giuseppe was the father of Unknown One. It was an unexpected twist for Giuseppe's family to discover he had been unfaithful. But yet another family was about to become embroiled in an already complicated investigation. In June 2014, Marshal Mossolino brought forward new evidence that blew the case wide open. His dogged detective work led him through interviews with various people, including former co-workers at the bus company. One of Mossolino's sources whispered a name, and when investigators delved further, they discovered that the woman was Esther Arzuffi. She'd been a neighbor of Giuseppe in Ponte Selva in the late 1960s and early 1970s. A quick cross-check of DNA testing showed investigators that they had already swabbed and collected DNA from Esther in July 2012. But a further check showed that Esther's DNA had been tested against Yara's DNA and not the Unknown One in a laboratory mix-up. Esther's DNA was quickly tested, and investigators made a bombshell discovery. Esther Arzuffi was the mother of Unknown One. Investigators met with and interviewed Esther Arzuffi. She denied having an affair and swore that her children were born from her husband, Gianni Bossetti. The already chaotic discovery was going to blow open another dark secret. All three of Esther's children were not born of the same father. Her youngest son's DNA proved not to be a match to either Giuseppe or Gianni. The next step was discovering who was the father of the two other children. They were a pair of twins, a boy and a girl. The girl was ruled out, but investigators looked into Esther's son, Massimo Giuseppe Bossetti. Ruggeri and her team looked into the background of Massimo Bossetti. He was a 42-year-old man who was married with 3 children. He lived in Mapello, near where Yara's phone last pinged off a cell phone tower. He also happened to work in the construction industry. According to DNA results, one of the key identifiers of Unknown One was that he'd have light-colored eyes. Massimo was short, tanned, and had piercing blue eyes. He was also known around town for being someone who loved to party. Ruggeri had to move fast to get his DNA before the media caught wind of the investigation. They needed to act with haste and find a method that didn't look suspicious. On June 15, 2014, their plan came to life. Investigators set up a fake roadblock with police breathalyzing drivers. They watched as Massimo's car approached. This was probably going to be their only chance to get the DNA they needed. In order to have a fail-safe, they had to secure 2 workable samples. Confidently, Massimo took the test. When police told him the test kit was broken, he allowed them to do a second test. Massimo then drove off, unaware that he'd just sealed his own fate. Having got the samples, Ruggeri pushed for an overnight test, and the result was astonishing. It was a moment of triumph for investigators as they finally identified their suspect. Massimo Bossetti was the Unknown One. Ruggeri did not move immediately to arrest Massimo. Instead, they monitored his movements. But fearing that news would leak and Massimo would become a flight risk, Ruggeri moved to arrest him on June 16, 2014. While Massimo remained in custody, investigators quickly began working on finding more evidence. Massimo seemed to have frequently hung around Yara's house. He often parked his car behind the sports center and ate at a pizzeria down the road from her family home. He also frequented a tanning salon that was near Yara's house. Investigators were about to discover an even more disturbing pattern. Massimo's internet searches revealed his perverted interests. They painted a picture of a man who had an obsession for young girls. His phone records also showed that he'd been present in Brembate de Sopra on the evening of Yara's disappearance. His phone had been switched off from 5:45 p.m. until 7:34 a.m. the next morning. More damning evidence came in the form of CCTV footage from a local bank. It showed the white Iveco Daily van Massimo used for work driving around the area on the night of Yara's disappearance. Forensic tests on the seat of the van proved that materials found on Yara's clothes matched the material found in Massimo's van interior. Massimo proclaimed his innocence from the very beginning. His trial began in July 2015 at the Court of Assize in Italy. Massimo's defense argued that the evidence found on Yara was caused by cross-contamination. Massimo alleged that his work tools had been stolen and the blood sample found on Yara's clothes may have come from one of his trowels, as he'd bled out on his tools after an injury at work. The defense then brought Massimo's wife, Martia Comi, who provided an alibi for her husband, but these were refuted after phone records proved that they did not have any contact on the night of Yara's disappearance. The prosecution then took the floor and presented the wealth of evidence they discovered, including the DNA samples, the physical evidence from Massimo's van, the internet searches, and telephone records. They then presented what they believed happened to Yara on the evening of November 26, 2010. The prosecution believed that Yara had been late to return home and was offered a lift by Massimo. Massimo then began driving in the opposite direction of Yara's home and was able to subdue her in his van. After being overpowered, Yara was taken to Cignola di Sola, where Massimo tried to assault her. Yara then fought back, and Massimo acted in a panic and hit her over the head with a blunt object. He then abandoned her there, believing she was dead, and fled. Yara, in the meantime, was unable to move due to blood loss, which left her in a weakened state, and she eventually succumbed to hypothermia. Having heard both the defense and prosecution's arguments, the Court of Assize came to a decision on July 1, 2016, a year after the trial began. Maximo Bossetti was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Yara Gambirasio. In July 2017, the Court of Assize of Appeals upheld the verdict. In October 2018, the Court of Cassation confirmed Massimo's life sentence. In November 2019, Massimo's defense team asked for a review of the DNA results. In March 2021, the request was rejected as there was no more DNA left to analyze. This led to prosecutor Letizia Ruggeri being accused of misdirection and trial fraud in December 2022. Massimo's defense believed that Ruggeri and her team needed to make him a scapegoat in the crime by planting evidence. She's since been under investigation while Massimo remains behind bars. Since the trial and imprisonment of Massimo Bossetti, his mother, Esther Arzuffi, has continued to deny her infidelity. The hate surrounding the family has affected his twin sister, who has been attacked twice. After the defense tried portraying Massimo as a family man, his marriage faced strain after two people came forward alleging to have had an affair with his wife Marita. The Gambirasio family has also felt the loss of Yara deeply. They've since sponsored a gymnastics trophy in Yara's name. Both Mora and Fluvio have turned away from the public eye, and Fluvio can often be seen looking over Yara's tombstone in the early evenings. The case of Yara Gambirasio is possibly one of the most twisted stories one would find out there. Too many coincidences and chance encounters eventually led to the discovery of a suspect who, to this day, still proclaims his innocence. That's why we ask you today about your thoughts on the case. Given the evidence and the manner in which the investigation played out, do you believe the authorities have found their killer, or is an innocent man behind bars?
C'est-à-dire cet inconnu qui a harcelé la famille du petit Grégory et qui s'est mis à leur pourrir la vie.
Oui, ce corbeau, il a tué.
D'abord à travers des coups de téléphone et ensuite à travers des lettres anonymes.
Qui annonce le crime avant que le crime soit commis. Déjà, ça rend fou tout le monde.
On October 16, 1984, 4-year-old Grégory Villemin was playing outside in his garden in L'Éponge-sur-Volant, Vosges, in northeastern France. His beautiful, loving mother, Christine, was busy with household chores. After a while, it was time for Grégory to come inside. But when Grégory's mother went outside to call him in, she discovered that little Grégory was nowhere to be seen. With over 3,000 newspaper articles, 50 academic theses, and 15 books dedicated to uncovering the truth, the case has been shrouded in mystery and intrigue for over 30 years. Who was involved in Grégory's disappearance? And why did the case capture the attention of the media? L'Éponge is a small village located in the northeastern part of France, in the Vosges department of the Lorraine region. It's situated in a hilly area near the border with Germany and is known for its beautiful natural surroundings, including forests, lakes, and rivers. The local economy of L'Éponge is primarily based on agriculture and forestry. The village is surrounded by vast forests, which provide a source of wood for the local sawmills and paper mills. In addition, there are several farms in the area that produce crops such as wheat, corn, and potatoes. These industries provide jobs to the local people. It's here in this idyllic setting that the Villemin family resided, and our story begins. It was one of those towns where gossip travels very quickly. The Villemin family was a large extended family deeply rooted in their hometown. With numerous cousins, aunts, and uncles, their family consisted of around 80 to 90 members. Little did they know that during the late 70s and early 80s, their idyllic life would be marred by the presence of an anonymous caller known only as the Raven. Starting from around 1978, the family was tormented by this unknown caller, who singled out each member with eerie messages and sinister threats. The calls were not mere pranks, but rather a hauntingly calculated scheme to terrorize the entire family. But they didn't realize that this anonymous caller would be responsible for the family's long forthcoming struggle with the law and the media. The Villemins family once tight-knit community became a place of suspicion and paranoia, as everyone wondered who could be behind such a heinous act. The family's lives were forever changed by the Raven and what he did in 1984. The haunting memories of those calls would stay with them for years to come. The name was based on a famous French movie about a woman who discovers that her husband is cheating on her. Outraged, she decides to seek revenge by sending anonymous letters to all the wives in their small village, exposing their husband's infidelity, signed as the Raven. Despite the fictional nature of the Raven, the term became associated with anonymous letters in France, especially those used to expose infidelity. In the real case of the Villemin family, the enigmatic Raven continued to torment them with a barrage of unsettling phone calls and letters. The caller's tactics were unpredictable and ranged from heavy breathing and sinister giggling to outright death threats. The only thing that the Villemin family was certain about was that the 26-year-old Jean-Marie was not the elusive Raven caller. Despite being a successful supervisor at a factory and known as the Little Boss Man, many family members felt he'd become arrogant and disconnected from his working-class roots. This animosity toward Jean-Marie was shared by the mysterious caller, who made it clear through their letters and phone calls that they despised him. The Villemin family knew that the caller's hatred for Jean-Marie ruled Jean out as a suspect, leaving them no closer to identifying the true culprit behind the Raven moniker. Jean-Marie was the primary target of the Raven's harassment. The caller's hatred of him stemmed from his success as a factory supervisor and his recent marriage to the 24-year-old Christine, a woman from a prestigious background who was admired for her eloquence and beauty. On the 24th of August 1980, Christine gave birth to Grégory Villemin. Jean-Marie and Christine were envied for their good looks and love for each other, and by 1983, Grégory was 3 years old. During that time, Grégory noticed the stress on his parents' faces every time the phone rang. The boy, only 3 years old, called the caller Mr. Man. In 1983, the couple moved to a beautiful house outside of town, hoping for some peace. But the Raven wasn't done yet. the caller became even more obsessed with Jean-Marie's success and started threatening to harm Christine. He'd call Jean-Marie at work and describe in detail the traps he'd laid out for Christine. Jean-Marie tried to stay strong and not give in to the Raven's threats. But the caller continued to push the limits, asking what Jean-Marie would do if he set their house on fire. Despite being concerned, Jean-Marie refused to show fear or give in to the caller's demands. Frustrated, the Raven upped the stakes by threatening to harm their 3-year-old son, Grégory. The Raven warned Jean-Marie not to let their son play outside after school, saying that he'd kidnap him. Jean-Marie, a loving father, was incensed by the threat and told the caller that he would kill him if he touched his son. The Raven realized that he'd finally found Jean-Marie's breaking point. The caller then disappeared for a year and a half, during which time there were no further calls to the Villemin family. Maybe this was because the family had alerted the police and started recording the calls. But this idea did not work, as the Raven shifted to sending vicious letters. These letters were not only filled with loathsome threats, but also contained direct and explicit references to the boss, Jean-Marie, who was responsible for overseeing a group of 20 men. The letter's contents were disturbing and deeply unsettling, with one vowing to skin the family alive, while others promised to spit upon their graves. The year was 1984, and there'd been a year and a half of silence with no suspicious threats or aggressive activities. The family thought that the Raven was gone for good. On October 16, 1984, Christine, Grégory's mother, picked up little Grégory after work from daycare. She went into the house and started playing music, while Grégory went outside to play in the front yard, as he always did. Around 5 p.m., it was time for Grégory to come inside. She looked outside, and Grégory wasn't there. She started to panic, but wasn't too alarmed since the Raven had been gone for a year and a half. Christine went out to look for Grégory. When she couldn't find him, she went to the houses of Grégory's friends, but no one knew where Grégory was. As she returned to her home, she received a phone call. It was her mother-in-law. She said, "The Raven has your son." The mother-in-law explained that her other son, Michel, who was Jean's brother, received a call from the Raven claiming that little Grégory's body had been dumped into a nearby river. Christine called the police, and they immediately began searching for little Grégory. However, within just a few hours of his disappearance, at around 9 p.m., they found his lifeless body floating in the local river. He was still wearing his little hat, which had been pulled down over his face so that it was impossible to see his face. He had on the same blue jacket that he'd worn for daycare earlier that day. But most disturbingly, he was tied up in a strange and ritualistic manner. His arms were bound, but he was still standing upright. They pulled him out of the river and were faced with the sight of a tiny 4-year-old body. Removing the hat, they were struck by how peaceful he looked. The cause of death was determined to be drowning from asphyxiation, but the way he was tied up made little sense. He was only 4 years old. If he was drowned, he wouldn't have struggled, cried, or even screamed. So why did he look so serene? As the investigation into the death of little Grégory continued, the police spoke to several people in the area. One person came forward with an insulin needle they'd found near the local river. Initially, the police suspected that someone from the Villemin family was responsible for Grégory's murder, as they believed the culprit must have had inside knowledge of the family's daily routines and activities. The case attracted the attention of journalists across France who traveled to the small town hoping to help solve the mystery. Then the next day, on October 17, 1984, a letter arrived at Jean-Marie and Christine's house. It had been mailed on the day Grégory was murdered and was postmarked from within the village. The letter contained a chilling message. "Hey boss, I hope you're happy now. Money won't bring back your son. This is my revenge." The writer referred to Jean-Marie as boss, which was a nickname given to him because he was the only one in his family to break out of the working class. The letter also suggested that the writer held a grudge against multiple members of the family. After receiving the letter, it was time for Grégory's funeral. On the 19th of October 1984, the entire family and town showed up, including all the police officers, hoping to analyze the faces of the guests for any suspicious behavior. Many journalists from France also attended the funeral, making it a big spectacle. They wanted pictures and photographs of the so-called event. During the funeral, the police were specifically looking for anyone who wasn't crying or was behaving erratically. But the press, they were busy with their photos and their videos. Despite Christine's heart-wrenching cries during the burial, the press didn't stop. The press took a lot of photos and videos of the funeral, including Christine being carried out because she was unable to stand. Although the police tried hard, the funeral didn't yield any new leads in the investigation. It only yielded more content for the vulture-like journalists. The police proceeded in bringing in the rest of the Villemin family for questioning. They decided to adopt a technique from the Raven movie mentioned earlier and instructed all family members to sit down and write the same letter with both their right and left hands. Afterward, the police said that they would get back to them once they analyzed the handwriting. They also interviewed distant relatives and family friends who reported receiving calls from what sounded like a woman, prompting the police to consider the possibility of multiple suspects. That is, this Raven character could be a woman, or a pair of a man and a woman, or just a miscreant who is mimicking these voices. The police now had the challenge of analyzing all the handwriting samples they'd gathered, as well as the new information about the possible involvement of a woman in the crime. As the handwriting samples were being analyzed by experts, the police considered the fact that the Raven had disappeared for a year and a half. They wondered if there had been some sort of event that triggered the Raven to get mad again, as they couldn't understand why they would go silent. The only thing they could find was that Jean-Marie's brother, Michel, had recently come over with his wife to Jean and Christine's house. Now, Michel was jealous of his brother's success and had a hard time holding down a job. 2 days before little Gregory disappeared, he was invited over to the Villemin house and was shown their new house extension, leather couch, and car. The police thought that maybe Michel was jealous of this, and this had triggered him to go into hiding and plan and commit the murder of Gregory. As the police questioned Michel, the handwriting experts knocked on the door with a surprising revelation. They had found a match to the handwriting, and it belonged to a cousin named Bernard Laroche, not Michel. This was a shock to everyone, and the police now had a new suspect to focus on. But the police wondered, who was Bernard, and why would he do this? Bernard Laroche was Jean-Marie's cousin from his mother's side. He was orphaned at a young age and started living with the brothers Jean and Michel. He spent a lot of time with Michel as they were very close, more like brothers than cousins. However, once Jean-Marie got married to Christine, conflicts began to arise between Bernard and Jean-Marie. Bernard disliked Christine and would often criticize her, calling her arrogant, annoying, snobbish, and stuck-up. But Jean-Marie defended his wife, saying that Christine was just misunderstood. This led to a lot of fighting between the two. The police confronted Bernard Laroche, presenting him with the evidence that his handwriting matched that of the Raven's letters. They demanded an explanation from him, to which he replied that he had an alibi for that day. He was with his sister-in-law. She was married to Bernard's brother and was not related to the Villemin family. Bernard claimed that he'd been with her the entire time and that there was no way he could have been at the river. The police informed Bernard that they'd be questioning his sister-in-law to verify his alibi. The investigators then brought in Bernard Laroche's sister-in-law, the 15-year-old Muriel, who claimed to have been with them on the day of Gregory's disappearance. She told the police that Bernard was telling the truth. However, during further questioning, a horrifying twist emerged that made the interrogation more complex. Muriel eventually admitted to lying and revealed that they'd not stayed home as she initially claimed. Instead, Bernard had picked her up from school and they went to a stranger's house. There, Bernard picked up a 4-year-old child and they drove to a nearby river. Bernard got out of the car with the child and returned without him. Muriel had not thought much of it at the time. She confessed to everything. After so many days, the police had an actual confession, and the handwriting tactic actually worked. The police informed the judge of Muriel's confession, as they could not hold Bernard without the judge's consent. The police had to obtain an arrest warrant from the presiding judge, Judge Lambert, based on Muriel's confession. However, when they went to him, he refused to hear her statement as it was a Friday and the next 2 days would be holidays. This was something unheard of from a judge, especially when the case had attracted national attention. But he suggested that they send her home with Bernard and ask her not to reveal anything to him until Monday. The police followed the judge's advice and sent Muriel home with Bernard. This move was also uncalled for, as Muriel could easily have told Bernard about her confession, and Bernard could have fled, or worse, Muriel could have changed her statement. But despite the possibility of her changing her story over the weekend or being influenced by others, she did not retract her statement when the police spoke to her again on Monday. On Monday, Muriel went to see Judge Lambert and repeated the same story. Her statement pretty much confirmed that Bernard Laroche was the killer of Grégory. They let Muriel go on Monday, and the judge immediately ordered Bernard's arrest. The revelation of Muriel's statement caused an uproar in the village. But how did the villagers know that it was Muriel who was the witness? Well, Judge Lambert publicly revealed Muriel's name on television, which was obviously not ideal, since it put her in a dangerous position and the case was still under investigation. The news led to Muriel being questioned by her sister, who was understandably upset. The rumors spread that Muriel was beaten up by her family members for her involvement in Bernard's arrest. So now, about a week after Bernard Laroche had been arrested and imprisoned, Muriel came on TV to speak with journalists. At this point, there was another twist in the story. Muriel claimed that the police had threatened to send her to a reformatory, tortured her, bullied her, and that's why she made a false confession. Everything she had said was a lie. She was scared, and they kept telling her that Bernard was guilty, so she went along with it. As a result, the judge had nothing against Bernard. Additionally, the handwriting analysis was thrown out of court due to some shady practices by the experts. The samples they'd taken were mixed with other samples, and even the experts could not figure out whose handwriting they were judging. Technically, they had nothing on Bernard Laroche, and he was released from prison. After this, Jean-Marie, the father of Grégory, was seen on TV saying that he would kill Bernard Laroche himself if the law didn't do it. He was convinced that Bernard had murdered his son, and this statement foreshadowed potential violence to come. By now, the media was playing a big role in this murder, which was eventually becoming a scandal. First, Judge Lambert revealed Muriel's name on TV. Then Muriel appeared on TV to reveal that the police mistreated her. And now, Jean-Marie had taken an oath on the TV that he would kill Bernard himself. By this point, the case was getting controlled by the media and misinformation. It was never confirmed whether the police actually threatened Muriel. She claimed that they threatened to send her away to a reformatory, but the truth is uncertain. Additionally, there were rumors that her family members beat her up to retract her confession after the judge revealed her name.
J'avais dit que j'étais dans le corps, là. Les gendarmes ont crié que j'étais pas dans le corps. Même le chauffeur de corps qui avait dit que j'étais pas dans le corps. Puis après, ils ont commencé à dire que Bernard avait avoué, que c'était le corbeau, tout ça.
Meanwhile, as all of this was unfolding, 4 girls unexpectedly showed up at the police office with news which seemed suspicious. The 4 girls claimed to have seen Christine, Grégory's mother, at the post office on the day of the murder, which Christine had not mentioned to the police. This led the police to question whether Christine was involved in her son's murder. Christine insisted that she went to the post office on Monday, October 15, 1984, the day before Grégory went missing. The police found a receipt that Christine had sent off at the post office, but it didn't have a postmark date, so it could have been from either Monday or Tuesday. The police began to question Christine, suspecting that whomever had mailed the letter was the one who murdered Grégory. The journalists covering the case of Grégory Villemin's murder were divided into 2 groups, those who believed Christine was involved and those who didn't. Judge Lambert was enjoying the attention the case was receiving from the national media of France. He went out of his way to pose for pictures and even asked journalists to take pictures of him in a natural setting, like at a market buying groceries. This was all caught on an audio recording that would later be released. But at the same time, these pictures were being printed in the newspapers. Judge Lambert was now in two minds about the case, whether to convict Bernard or convict Christine. Whichever way he chose, he had no proof on either of them. Some journalists were even heard saying that Lambert had a crush on Christine because she was very attractive and mesmerizing. She even looked younger than her age, and her looks were captivating, almost casting a spell. And so, Christine became France's most hated woman overnight. If she was convicted and went to jail, she would be the worst mother. But if she were found not guilty, it's because the judge loved her. This was what the media was feeding to the general public. Amidst all this, Christine and Jean-Marie decided to sell their house and try to get pregnant again. They were struggling to cope after the harassment from the press and the murder of their 4-year-old son. Friends and family encouraged them to have another child, believing it would give them a reason to live. Christine and Jean-Marie conceived a set of twins in 1985. Meanwhile, the press continued to criticize and hate on Christine, with a police officer even commenting on her attire and claiming it was too flirtatious for a grieving woman. When it was announced that Christine was pregnant again and she began to show, people accused her of trying to use her pregnancy as a way to gain sympathy and avoid prison. The police brought her in for questioning again, focusing on the false accusations that she had an affair and that Grégory was not Jean-Marie's child. They also asked her to do a handwriting test and write the Raven's letters with both her right and left hand, which she did before returning home. Christine and Jean-Marie waited for the results of the handwriting tests, as the police and the judge had no evidence against Christine. These tests would confirm that Christine was not involved at all in Grégory's murder, and the couple could at last focus on their lives. But after a couple of weeks, on the 25th of March 1985, the press announced that the judge had confirmed the match of Christine's handwriting. This was devastating for the mother. She stopped eating, broke down, and was hospitalized. During this time, she lost one of her twins due to the stress caused by the judge's actions. The judge informed her that she was going to be arrested and tried for her own son's murder. Jean-Marie wanted nothing more than to take his wife home, but she was still hospitalized. He began to wander around outside, feeling lost and helpless. On March 29, 1985, Jean went to Grégory's cemetery where he claimed to hear his deceased son speaking to him. In a fit of rage and despair, Jean drove to Bernard Laroche's house and shot him in front of his family with a shotgun. Filled with remorse, he immediately drove to the clinic to confess to Christine and apologize for what he'd done. He then turned himself into the police station. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 5 years in prison. With credit for time served awaiting trial and a partial suspension of the sentence, he was released in December 1987 after having served 2.5 years. Meanwhile, the media went into a frenzy over the shocking events that had unfolded. Christine, pregnant and now without Jean, was left to face the aftermath alone. After the shooting, Christine was released from the hospital but faced harsh criticism from the press. They accused her of being a witch who used spells to get pregnant again, and of being a terrible mother who murdered her own son. Christine tried to stay strong in public and didn't show her emotions, fearing that the press would twist her sadness into something negative. However, this led people to describe her as cold and unfeeling. To make matters worse, rumors began to surface that Christine had run off with another man just 2 months before her wedding to Jean-Marie. People speculated that she never wanted to get married, have children, or be tied down to a son. Another rumor was spread by Judge Lambert that alleged Jean-Marie brought home 2 steaks for Christine, who overcooked them. In response, Jean-Marie slapped her. Though the story seemed untrue, the judge told journalists about it. This further fueled public criticism of Christine. The media supported this narrative that Christine became increasingly angry, particularly for mothers who were abused by their husbands or held back by their children. This led to new press headlines that she had turned herself into a witch by sacrificing her son. the judge decided to arrest Christine because of the public's growing outrage. She was 6 months pregnant at the time and had already been away from her husband. Despite a lack of evidence, in July 1985, Christine was charged with Grégory's murder. She went on a hunger strike for 11 days in protest, and Jean-Marie followed suit. Christine was freed after an appeals court cited flimsy evidence and the absence of a coherent motive. 2 months later, Christine gave birth to her son, and she was paid by journalists for pictures of her holding him. Christine agreed because Jean-Marie and her had lost their home, and now they also had to pay for their legal defense. Despite the destitute state of the family, the pictures were later used to write a nasty article that suggested she would kill her next child. What was interesting to notice was that the same 3 journalists were writing under different names for dozens of news outlets, making it seem like the whole world hated Christine. But in reality, it was just those 3 people. Later that year, Christine's health took a toll on her. She overdosed on tranquilizers and was taken to the hospital, but thankfully, she did not lose her life. In 1987, the main judge, Judge Lambert, was removed from the case after it was discovered that he had no evidence to arrest Christine and had engaged in shady practices. He'd been arranging meetings with journalists at the market to spread rumors and accusations against Christine. He was replaced by a new judge who took a fresh look at the case and did a lot of thorough work. During his 1-year sabbatical, Judge Lambert wrote a book about the case. In it, he described Christine as one of the most captivating people he'd ever met. He also labeled her as manipulative and an evil black widow, causing confusion among the public. However, the new judge refused to base his conclusions on the previous judge's opinions and thoroughly investigated the case. Eventually, Christine and her son were allowed a breather. The second judge decided to follow the insulin lead in the Grégory Villemin case, as it made sense that the child looked peaceful when found in the river. Upon investigation, they discovered that the only person in the family who had access to insulin prescriptions was Bernard Laroche's mother-in-law, as she had diabetes. However, the Laroches were uncooperative during questioning. Soon after, a journalist was able to trick Judge Number 2 into giving an interview, secretly recording the conversation. In the recording, the second judge revealed that he believed the Laroches were guilty and that Bernard was the culprit. The journalist released the recording, causing the second judge to be taken off the case. A few weeks later, he was found in a coma in his cabin after suffering a heart attack. After the second judge went into a coma, he suffered from memory loss and could not recall the case of Christine and Grégory. A third judge was then appointed to take on the case. The judge reviewed the work that the second judge had done and concluded that there was not enough evidence to charge Christine with any crime. Thus, all charges against her were formally dropped on February 2, 1993, and it was publicly declared that she was innocent. Despite this, none of the journalists who had slandered Christine apologized for their actions. After this, in 2000, the authorities requested to check the DNA as all the letters from the Raven had a licked stamp. However, when they attempted to test the DNA, it was discovered that the letters had not been stored properly in evidence, rendering the DNA almost unusable. In 2000, there were talks about reopening the case after the discovery that DNA testing was possible on the licked stamps from the Raven's letters. Despite the attention the case had been receiving, there were no significant developments, and the case went cold in 2001 after DNA testing on a stamp used for one of the Raven's letters yielded no new evidence. In 2004, 3 years after the last DNA test, the Villemins finally received compensation of 35,000 euros from the court for the immense personal harm they endured due to the mishandling of their son's investigation. The cameras, the jail time, the wrongful accusations, it was all too much for any parent to bear. And let's not forget the years of living in fear, never knowing when or where the mysterious Raven would strike again. Fast forward to 2008, and investigators were once again poring over the evidence. At the request of the Villemin, they ran further tests to look for DNA on Grégory's bindings and some of the letters. Could this finally be the breakthrough they'd been waiting for? But alas, all came up inconclusive. The killer was still out there, taunting them. But hope was not yet lost. In April 2013, they decided to test Gregory's clothing and shoes next. Could this be it? Would they finally find the crucial evidence they needed to solve this case once and for all? But the odds were against them. If the killer did leave some DNA behind, the water more than likely had washed it away. Still, they persisted. They had to give the Villemins some closure, some peace of mind. The tension was palpable as they awaited the results of the tests. And when they finally came back, it was yet another blow. Inconclusive yet again. The killer was still out there, lurking in the shadows. The question remained, would they ever catch him? The case of Grégory Villemin's murder remained cold until June 2017, when a glimmer of hope emerged in the form of a cutting-edge software called Anacrim. With the power to flag inconsistencies in suspect statements, the police began combing through interviews with Villemin's extended family, leading them to Marcel and Jacqueline Jacob, the boy's great aunt and uncle. With evidence pointing towards the Raven being the work of a man and a woman, the police suspected that the couple might fit the profile. Moreover, they had a motive, as they were believed to have a grudge against Muriel Boll, a key witness in the case. Marcel and Jacqueline Jacob raised Bernard Laroche when Bernard's mother died. And so they were certainly angry at Muriel for her confession. Her confession eventually became the reason for the death of Bernard. The police were also investigating why Muriel Boll reverted her confession about Bernard, and who allegedly beat Muriel, which led her to change her statements in front of the media. As the investigation intensified, the tension rose, and the suspects were finally questioned. But just when it seemed like the case was about to be solved, all three were released, as the police couldn't reach any conclusion through the interrogation. This left the police and the public frustrated, and no closer to finding the real killer. The announcement that Gregory's case would be reopened sent shockwaves through the local community. But it was the sudden and mysterious death of the first judge, Judge Lambert, that truly sent chills down spines. On July 11, 2017, Judge Lambert was found lifeless with a plastic bag over his face. The police claimed that he had taken his own life by asphyxiating himself. But with mounting pressure from the renewed investigation, many began to question whether there was more to the story than met the eye. Lambert's farewell letter to the local newspaper only added to the intrigue, hinting at secrets and scandals within the French justice system. The judge said that he refused to be the scapegoat again. Judge Lambert was the judge responsible for sending Muriel back home when she confessed that Bernard was the killer. He was also responsible for the witch theory that devastated Christine for years. In 2018, the Villemin case was once again thrust into the spotlight as Muriel Boll, a central figure in the investigation, published a bombshell book entitled Breaking the Silence. In the pages of this book, she accused the police of extracting a false confession from her and maintained the innocence of her cousin Bernard, who'd been charged with Gregory's murder. She also wrote that the cousin who claimed Muriel had been beaten into taking her statement back was outright lying. But Muriel's explosive allegations didn't sit well with her own family, as the cousin took offense to her claims and filed a complaint against her. Soon, Muriel found herself indicted for aggravated defamation in 2019. As the Villemin family's decades-long search for answers continued, they received a glimmer of hope in December 2020. French media revealed that a Swiss firm's analysis of the threatening letters had pointed to a single suspect. Finally, it seemed like the truth was within their grasp. But in a tragic twist of fate, the identity of the suspect was never revealed, leaving the family once again grappling with the uncertainty and despair of not knowing who was responsible for their unimaginable suffering. As the new year dawned, the Villemins continued to fight for justice. In January 2021, an appeals court in Dijon accepted their requests to compare DNA samples found on evidence to determine whether they came from their extended family. But with the years ticking by and no solid answers in sight, the family's hopes of closure faded with each passing day. The Villemin family's story is a stark reminder of the cruel and senseless nature of crime. Despite their tireless efforts, the family has still not been able to find the peace and resolution they so desperately craved. Instead, they've been left with an agonizing void, forever haunted by the mystery of what really happened to their beloved little Grégory. The case remains an unsolved mystery. The Villemins are yet to know who killed little Grégory. That's all about the mysterious disappearance of Grégory Villemin. We hope you found it as fascinating as we did. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think that the judges could have done a better job? And what other suspects do you think further DNA analysis could uncover?
I didn't realize I ran a red light. And I got out of the car, walked back to their car. My feelings were that what I had done was going to cause me to go to death row. So when the officer turned away from me, I shot both officers.
On July 22nd, 1957, in the city of El Segundo, 4 teenagers were stripped naked on the Lover's Lane. They roamed around, asking for help, in shock at what had just happened to them. At some distance, 28-year-old Officer Phillips and 27-year-old Officer Curtis were doing their regular patrolling near the traffic signal when they met a case of rash driving. 2 other officers passed by asking if everything was all right, and the patrolling officers waved at them, signaling that everything was fine. But the next thing you know, gunshots had been fired, leaving the 2 police officers dead. Was there a relation between these crimes? And what motive did these bizarre crimes hold? Let's find out. El Segundo is located in Los Angeles County, California. El Segundo has a small town feel, with a charming downtown area and numerous parks and green spaces. The city is just a few miles from the beaches of Manhattan and Hermosa, making it a popular spot for residents and visitors. But despite these achievements, Los Angeles County has been ranked as the most perilous place in the entire United States for police officers, with a harrowing statistic of nearly 1 officer being shot while on duty every single day of the year. A specialized Crimes Against Police Officers unit had been established to prosecute those who harm or kill law enforcement officials, with the unit frequently handling cases where 5, 6, 7, 8, or even 10 police officers are shot at in any given week. It was in this county's small city, El Segundo, that a ruthless cop killing in 1957 haunted the police force for nearly half a century. On the summer night of July 22, 1957, a group of 4 teenagers, including the 17-year-old Bob Dewar, were driving down a well-known Lover's Lane in Hawthorne, California after a party. The 2 boys, including Dewar, were looking for a safe place to hang around with their 2 female friends. Dewar decided to roll down a window and enjoy the warm air, when suddenly a man appeared and pointed a gun at his face.
Now you saw the gun as the only thing that came through the window. That was my whole life in that millisecond.
The man demanded money and assured the teens that he wouldn't harm them. The frightened teens handed over their money and prayed that the man would keep his word. After this, they were forced at gunpoint by the man to undress. The man then used surgical tape and a flashlight to tie up their hands and cover their eyes. One of the young women was also assaulted while the others lay helpless. The man threatened to kill them and ordered them to march into a nearby field.
Well, I thought for sure that he would kill the girl because she probably had seen him, but I guess he was going to kill all of us. And we stood out there stark naked for like 3 or 4 minutes. We just expected to hear the gun start going off.
As they stumbled blindly, they heard their car's door close and the sound of the car driving away. The man had stolen their vehicle, leaving them stranded in the middle of nowhere, naked and vulnerable. At some distance, 2 police officers, 28-year-old Richard Phillips and 27-year-old Milton Curtis, were on patrol when they saw a car run a red light. They pulled the car over and asked the driver to get out. While they were doing this, another police car drove by and offered to help, but Richard and Milton signaled that everything was all right.
The car had not been reported stolen at that time, therefore it was not in the system. So there was no way for those officers to have known that was a stolen vehicle or it had just been used in that crime.
Suddenly, the driver pulled out a .22 caliber revolver and shot both officers 3 times each. Officer Phillips managed to shoot back 3 times before calling for backup on the radio, despite being badly hurt. Alas, both the officers died at the crime scene.
He's like, what are they doing here? And it was pretty much like, he's sleeping, but why doesn't he come home and sleep? And she says he's in heaven.
As the news of the brutal killing of officers Phillips and Curtis spread like wildfire through the community, the police were on high alert. Every lead was followed, and every bystander was questioned, but the case seemed to be at a standstill. That was until the 4 terrified teenagers who had been brutally robbed and assaulted stumbled onto the scene, revealing a crucial piece of information that linked their case to the murders of the officers: the car. Within minutes, the police had located the abandoned 1949 Ford sedan. The car had bullet holes that were made by Officer Phillips taking shots at the attacker. The police also took fingerprints from the teenagers' clothes in the car, but it yielded nothing.
When they called me that there had been 2 policemen shot and killed, so I knew the importance of the situation. If there was any evidence that I could get, I'd have to get it.
With no other leads to follow, the police were at a loss. The media was on the case, spreading the word far and wide. As the days turned into weeks, the tension mounted, but the case was just not progressing. In 1958, True Detective magazine featured the murders along with a plea for the public's help. All leads that came in from it were checked, but nothing turned up. The investigation into the murders of the 2 officers and the robbery of the teenagers had hit a dead end. But then, 2 years later, in 1960, a resident in Manhattan Beach made a shocking discovery. 2 watches and a revolver were found buried in his backyard, and the watches were found to belong to the 4 teenagers whose car and belongings were taken forcefully by the criminal.
He was clearing out his backyard and found the chamber to a handgun and thought, well, maybe it had something to do with the frame that he found a year prior. So he went in his garage, looked at it, put it together, and found that it was a match.
The police ran ballistics tests on the gun and discovered that it was the same one used to kill the officers. But despite tracking the revolver's serial number, they were unable to identify the owner or the killer. The trail seemed to have gone cold once again. It wasn't until later that investigators discovered that the gun was purchased just 4 days before the murders in a Sears store in Shreveport, Louisiana. The buyer had used the name G.D. Wilson and given a fake address in Miami, Florida.
The person who sold that gun, he told him that he believed the man was from out of town, and his accent didn't sound like a Louisiana accent. It sounded more southern than that.
A customer at the YMCA near the Sears store had signed in under the name George D. Wilson, claiming to be from Miami and using the same fake address.
We actually went into the room where this George Wilson had checked in, and from this window of this room, you could see the Sears store. And it was just kind of, for us, it was kind of overwhelming being in there and seeing that and trying to figure out what was going on in this man's mind when he was there.
The police now had a lead, but it led them to dead end after dead end. They tracked down every George D. Wilson in the Miami area, but none of them was the killer. The case remained unsolved, and the killer remained at large, haunting the memories of those who remembered that fateful night. But due to a lack of new leads and information, the case went cold again.
But then over a period of time, too, it was like nothing was being solved, nothing was coming up, everything went cold on it.
Decades later, in 2002, a glimmer of hope emerged when El Segundo officers received a chilling tip from a woman claiming that her uncle had bragged about killing 2 police officers. As investigators delved deeper, they discovered that her uncle's fingerprints had been previously checked against those found in the getaway car in the late 1950s, but to no avail. Nevertheless, This tip brought renewed attention to the case, and it was decided that the original prints would be re-examined using the FBI's Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, or IAFIS.
Sometimes there's areas that are not clear. They could be smudged. There could be artifacts in there that are not clear. So the computer may count that or read that as a particular characteristic.
The prints were entered into the system, and after some time, the system revealed that the prints were a match to a man named Gerald Fitton Mason.
We stood hovering over his computer screen, looking at all the ridge structure and the information there, and everything coincided. My words were, "Oh my God."
The police were puzzled because the man of this name was never suspected during the investigation. Gerald Fitton Mason, a man with a troubled past, was born in South Carolina on January 31st, 1934. After a brief stint in the Army, he quickly found himself on the wrong side of the law, getting arrested for homebreaking and larceny in the 1950s. He only served 8 months of his 3-year sentence and was then released. It was shortly after this that he was involved in the incidents in El Segundo. Eventually, after that, Mason settled down and married his wife Betty in 1960, starting a family with 2 daughters who would later give him 3 grandchildren. He led a seemingly normal life as a successful gas station and convenience store owner in the Columbia area. The investigators had been working tirelessly to solve the case, and finally, they had their lead. Signatures from the YMCA registry and Sears store receipts were matched with current handwriting samples for Mason. But they needed more evidence to build a solid case.
Now we've got a real suspect, but we were still a little bit apprehensive. Okay, it's a fingerprint, it's an old fingerprint. What else do we have?
That's when they found 3 eyewitnesses who could still identify Mason: the 2 officers who were waved off on the night of the murder and a news reporter from the murder scene. The reporter recalled that Mason had asked him for a ride home somewhere near the crime scene. On January 29, 2003, the investigators arrived at Mason's door. When he opened it, they told him they were from El Segundo and were homicide detectives. As the investigators confronted Mason, he stammered and said that he thought he needed a lawyer, hoping to buy himself some time. However, the detectives were relentless and informed him that they were there to arrest him for the murder of 2 police officers over 45 years ago. Mason gasped in disbelief. He said he couldn't believe they were bothering him with something that happened so many years ago, trying to deflect their accusations.
When we introduced ourselves and told him we were homicide investigators, he was a little bit irritated, and it was almost like, "You're here for that? That happened so long ago. I can't believe you're here bothering me with that, 45, 46 years later."
But the detectives were unrelenting, and they took him into custody for questioning. As they examined his body for evidence, they found a scar on the back of his right shoulder blade, a stark reminder of the 3rd bullet that came out from the late Officer Phillips's gun.
Very last thing he did in life was to mark forever the man who killed him and his partner. And that's pretty compelling, because it's almost as if someone is speaking to you from the grave, telling you, "Ladies and gentlemen, I told you who it is. I pointed him out with my gunfire."
Under questioning, Mason gave a puzzling explanation for the crimes, claiming that he'd bought the revolver solely to fend off potential hitchhiking robbers. Now, why would someone who bought a revolver to protect himself commit such heinous crimes? Maybe the weapon affected Mason's psychology, making him more and more barbaric. But then, the investigators soon discovered a strange collection of guns in his home, including another one of the same rare 9-shot .22 revolvers used in the murders. So, it was clear that the reason Mason gave for purchasing the guns was totally a desperate lie. Amidst these bizarre circumstances, Mason was charged with 2 counts of murder, as well as additional charges for kidnapping, robbery, and assault. As the trial approached, Mason's family watched in despair as he accepted a plea deal that would drop the charges of kidnapping, robbery, and assault. On March 24, 2003, the day of the plea deal, Mason looked tired and defeated. He knew that he'd be spending the rest of his life in prison, but he wanted to spare his family the anguish of a full trial.
I didn't realize I ran a red light. And I got out of the car, walked back to their car. My feelings were that what I had done was going to cause me to go to death row. So when the officer turned away from me, I shot both officers.
As he pled guilty to 2 counts of murder, the families of the slain officers wept openly, and even Mason's own family looked on in silence, devastated by what had become of their loved one. Mason was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison, and as he stood before the court, he made a plea for forgiveness.
It's impossible to express to so many people how sorry I am for the harm I inflicted that night. I do not understand why I did this. It is contrary to all I believe in. It does not fit in my life. It is not the person I know. I detest these crimes.
He continued, with tears streaming down his face, that he didn't know why he did it and pleaded for forgiveness, begging them not to be bitter. He apologized profusely, saying he was so sorry for what he'd done. Despite his emotional plea, the family of Officer Curtis was unmoved. They believed that Mason was only remorseful because he'd been caught. Carolyn, Officer Phillips's daughter, expressed that Mason had caused her mother to become a widow and that his cowardly act had shattered their family's lives permanently. She stated that they could not and would not forgive him. Jean Curtis, Officer Milton Curtis's wife, shared that her husband was her first love. She revealed that on the night of the murder, they had a minor disagreement, and she'd always felt guilty about it. She added that they never had the chance to say goodbye. Her words weighed heavily in the courtroom as silence fell. After years of waiting for justice, Officer Curtis and Officer Phillips's families finally received closure. The murderer was found, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. However, the pain of their loss never fully healed, and they were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Jean Curtis was left with only memories of her beloved husband, while Officer Phillips's children were forced to grow up without a father.
What people would say about him being at 24 years old and committing these crimes and then living a life crime-free, it doesn't matter. He's a thief, he's a rapist, and he's a murderer. He just got old. That's all there is to it.
If there's a case you'd like us to cover, don't hesitate to drop your recommendations in the comment section below. And please remember to subscribe to our channel and share our videos with your friends and family. Until next time, stay safe.